Socialism in Power. On the History and Theory of Socialist Governance. By Roland BOER, School of Philosophy, Renmin University of China, Beijing, China. For Yang Huilin, my wise mentor. 2023. Preface. This monograph concerns the historical development, in practice and theory, of governance in socialist systems. Some years ago now, I began to think of a work that would deal systematically with this question, since there is now more than a century of concrete experience and its associated theoretical reflection. The vastness of the task, however, soon became apparent. On the way, I found myself needing to develop some aspects of the project. The study of Engels became a monograph, entitled Friedrich Engels and the Foundations of Socialist Governance, Springer, 2021. I also realized that the developments in China required in-depth research and another separate work, which became Socialism, with Chinese Characteristics, a Guide for Foreigners, Springer, 2021. With these tasks completed, I could finally return to the original task. This book is the result. The book seeks to bring together the historical realities of socialist systems of governance and its associated theoretical reflection, which is framed by the Marxist tradition. In that light, I begin with analyses of the works of Marx and Engels. This is the task of the opening two chapters, in which I emphasize in particular the influence of Engels in establishing the basic principles of socialist governance. From here, I devote 3 chapters to the Soviet Union, which was the first country in human history to experience socialism in power. The second half of the book moves to East Asia, with an initial chapter devoted to the DPRK, North Korea, before focusing in the remaining chapters on China, which arguably has the most developed form of socialist governance. From this research, it has become abundantly clear that the form of governance that emerged after the proletarian revolutions was and is unlike any other form that has hitherto appeared. This new form is not a version of the Western European nation-state, not an empire or colonizing power, and not a federation. This book, in one respect, is an examination of what exactly this new form is. Further, there are still too few works available in English that provide a fair assessment of the experiences of socialism in power. The main reason for such a scarcity of English-language works is the imposition of a Western liberal framework, and thus the model of the Western capitalist nation-state on socialist development. Such a model is an ill fit indeed for countries with very different histories, cultures, and traditions of governance. This Western liberal model has also influenced a few too many Western Marxist dismissals, for reasons too many to enumerate here, of any actual experience of socialism in power. By contrast, the works that do seek to understand socialism in power on its own terms are still relatively few. I have, of course, made use of the few works that do so, but my primary sources throughout are from the countries in question. Over the years, I have benefited from many discussions, debates, and feedback on earlier efforts related to this book. Many are comrades, colleagues, and friends in China who have contributed directly and indirectly to the present work. I think particularly of Yang Huilin, who has been a wise and extraordinary mentor in China for a long time now. Also at Renmin University of China are Zhang Fengyu and Zhang Jing, my old friends. Thanks also to Hong Xiaonan, Feng Yumei, Chu Hong, and Song Liang at Dalian University of Technology's School of Marxism. Not to be neglected are the fine scholars at the Academy of Marxism within the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Deng Chundong, Wang Zhongbao, and Liu Zishu are just a few among many. They have provided invaluable feedback, especially when I thought I knew much but actually knew very little, as well as opportunities to present papers and publications in journals. I would also like to thank someone who has become my editor at the Beijing office of Springer. Liana Lee is the epitome of professionalism and efficiency. In Australia, I thank Colin McCarris and have valued his immense knowledge and experience in China. Tamara Prosik has debated with me many aspects of developments in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, as has Roger Markwick with regard to the early days of the Soviet Union. I am also deeply grateful to comrades in the Communist Party of Australia for their lively interest and engagement with some of the topics discussed here. At the risk of leaving out names, I will not name them here, but they know very well who they are. Among colleagues in Europe, Yanis Kokosalakis has been invaluable in relation to worker democracy in the Soviet Union, having made available his groundbreaking work on which I rely in chapters 3 and 5 before publication. In relation to the DPRK, Keith Bennett's suggestions have been invaluable in light of his immense and long-standing experience in the country. Stefano Azaras has urged me to appreciate more than I often do what is actually beneficial from the Western tradition, and Antonis Balasopoulos has pushed me to think through the philosophical implications of the communist project. I also thank Hans Fellner and Mark Puschel from among a fine younger generation of Austrian and German Marxist scholars, as well as Con Kongel, who works at Nanjing University. Finally, the one who knows most about this work, as I do of hers, is Christina Peterson, for whom I thank for the many years now of working on our common project. To Nagabi East, May 2022, Roland BOER. Chapter 1. Introduction. The primary task of this introduction is to provide an overview of the argument as a whole. As mentioned, my concern is the practice and theory of socialist governance, which now has a history of more than a century. Some crucial features of the way this study is framed need to be highlighted. First, there is a qualitative difference between a communist party seeking power through revolutionary processes and the actual exercise of power. As Lenin observed, gaining power through a proletarian revolution is relatively easy. Seeking to construct socialism after taking power is exponentially more complicated. Hence the title of the book, Socialism in Power. Second, the tradition of socialist governance is a living tradition, a constant work in progress. It is neither a given, which one can know in advance, nor unchangeable. Third, the agenda for this work in progress is set by the Marxist method. This last point should be obvious, but it needs to be emphasized. The agenda is not set by Western liberal criticisms, but by the Marxist method itself in relation to the developments of socialist governance. By Marxist method, I mean Marxism-Leninism as a guide for socialist construction. In this light, there is an important distinction common in China and elsewhere between basic principles and specific judgments made in light of specific circumstances. Obviously, the latter are not permanent but are determined by specific cultural traditions, histories, and problems that need to be solved. What about the basic principles? These remain, but they are not immutable, unchangeable in time and place, and simply applied. Instead, they undergo a process of innovation and development, being enriched in the process. Why do I use the term socialist governance and not, for example, socialist politics or the socialist state? The reason arises from my earlier study of Engels, who argued that any form of the state is a separated public power, with the state in constant tension with, and indeed alienated from, society. He proposed that in a socialist system a public power would be enmeshed within society, and thus not be a state in the sense in which he defined it. That said, From Lenin onwards, we do begin to find the terminology of a proletarian state and a socialist state, albeit with the crucial qualifier that it is entirely new and without precedent in history. The emphasis here is on a qualitatively different type of state, one in which urban and rural workers are masters through the Communist Party, and the state is enmeshed within society. In the relevant chapters, I do study this development, although my preference, influenced by Engels, is for the terminology of socialist governance. I am also influenced by a country I know rather well, China. For example, the 3 core volumes by Xi Jinping have the English title The Governance of China. The Chinese is 探知国理政, talking about the management of state affairs, or governing a country. I am well aware of the limitations of this work. While I deal with Marx and Engels, the Soviet Union, DPRK, and China, there are many other contexts, from Eastern Europe through other countries in East Asia to Latin America and Africa, that are very worthy of study concerning developments of socialist governance, no matter whether the time frame is shorter or longer. But such a task would require many volumes, the work of other specialists, and is beyond the scope of this work. Given the nature of publications in our time, I provide here a synopsis of the remaining chapters in the book. Chapter 2, Marx's Ambivalence, State, Proletarian, Dictatorship, and Commune. This chapter concerns what Marx had to say regarding hitherto existing forms of the state and what might happen to the state under socialism in power after a communist revolution. The chapter is divided into 4 sections, the first of which deals briefly with Marx's observations on hitherto existing forms of the state. The second section turns to my main concern, which is what happens after a proletarian revolution. Here I deal with the dictatorship of the proletariat, a term coined by Marx and defended, as we shall see in the next chapter, assiduously by Engels. The third section deals with the commune based on the experiment in Paris in 1871. The material on the proletarian dictatorship and the commune raises a number of problems, which Marx did not solve, and indeed left for Engels to seek a solution. The final section focuses on Marx's fascinating struggle in trying to deal with forms of governance under communism. That he realized such governance is necessary is clear, but that he was also reticent to spell it out in detail is also obvious, not least because he knew that he did not have the experience and thereby evidence to undertake a scientific study of what happens to the state under communism. Chapter 3, Friedrich Engels and the Foundations of Socialist Governance. In this chapter, I summarize the argument of an earlier monograph on this topic, Friedrich Engels and the Foundations of Socialist Governance, Springer 2021, since it was actually Engels who provided the basic principles for what socialist governance might be. The chapter begins with a summary of Engels' well-known theory of forms of the state that had existed thus far, which may be formulated in terms of the state as a separated public power. Of more pertinence for socialist construction are his subsequent proposals. These begin with the explicit identification not found in Marx of the Paris Commune as the dictatorship of the proletariat, as well as the important role of force, Gewalt, in the initial exercise of proletarian power. Engels also sought to clarify the crucial theory of the dying away of the state, in response to the anarchists, who proposed that the first act of socialist power would be the abolition, Abschaffung, of the state. Engels emphasized that the state would die away of its own accord as one of the last results of socialism in power. It would not happen quickly, but would take a long time indeed. The final part of the chapter elaborates on Engels' principles of socialist governance. These are 1. Public power, Gewalt, continues, although it would not be separated from but stand in the midst of society. 2. Since it is not based on class conflict, it would lose its political character. 3. Governance entails the administration of things and the management of the processes of production for the sake of the true interests of society. 4. This reality may be seen as a dialectical transformation, an Aufhebung of baseline communism. Chapter 4, Lenin, Before and After October. Lenin occupies a unique position since he experienced both seeking power and exercising power, both the struggle before October and the difficulties of socialist construction after October, albeit too briefly. The chapter is structured around this threshold. It begins with Lenin's pre-October reflections on the state democracy and what forms governance might take after a proletarian revolution. At this stage, Lenin was restricted to interpreting the texts, primarily of Engels, but also Marx, along with the experiences of revolutionary struggle. The second section provides an overview of the practical experiences of the early days of Soviet power, identifying the transitions toward institutionalization, leadership of the Communist Party, and socialist democracy. The third section examines Lenin's theoretical deliberations on what was happening, seeking to discern the shape of socialist governance in light of rapidly developing conditions. Here, I address through close attention to the immediate tasks of Soviet power, the leadership of the Communist Party, including leadership over and training of the masses of workers and peasants, the need for iron discipline, and the concomitant developments of worker democracy. I also address developments in the theory of socialist democracy as the highest form of democracy and the concept of democratic centralism, which would come to have profound influence in the communist tradition. I close by asking what has happened to the state as, following Engels, a separated public power, and identify the unexpected beginning of the long process of the state's dying away from the first moments of the proletarian revolution. Chapter 5. The Soviet Union as a multinational and anti-colonial state. Lenin had only a few years to experience the actual practice of socialist governance, so he was able to see only its nascent forms beginning to emerge. It was in the context of Stalin's long tenure that real developments took place on the ground. These 3 decades, from the early 1920s to 1953, constitute one of the most formative periods for socialist governance. Given its importance, I devote 2 chapters to the topic. The present chapter deals with the central role of multiple, and especially minority, nationalities in the structures of socialist governance. It begins specifying why we should use nationality and not ethnic group, and outlines the debates among Marxist parties at the turn of the 20th century, especially those in Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Caucasus. Stalin's deeply influential essay, Marxism and the National Question of 1913, was a response to these debates. In this essay, he argues against the proposal that cultural national autonomy should be the determining feature of a federated socialist country. Instead, class should be the unifying feature, so much so that the totalizing unity of class would provide a more genuine and comprehensive foundation for fostering hitherto unexpected levels of diversity. It was precisely on this principle that the world's first comprehensive policy for minority nationalities was developed in the Soviet Union after 1917. After providing some detail concerning these policies, the chapter then examines how this focus on many nationalities within the Soviet Union led to a crucial insight. In the same way that the liberation of nationalities was enabled through the October Revolution, so also should colonized people seek liberation through anti-colonial struggles of national liberation. The final part of the chapter examines how this insight developed in the 1920s and how it was enacted through the many dimensions of assistance to and indeed fostering of national liberation movements throughout the world. The chapter concludes with a consideration of the internal problem generated in the Soviet Union with the constitutional right for autonomous republics to secede, and how subsequent socialist countries have not followed this example. Chapter 6. Soviet Democracy and a Socialist State. This chapter focuses on how the basic features of socialist democracy in the Soviet Union began to emerge in the 1920s, and especially 1930s. There are 4 features. 1. The first and faltering attempts to promote electoral democracy, and especially the campaign for universal multi-candidate and contested elections in the later 1930s. 2. The substantial and abiding contribution to consultative democracy through the primary party organizations, PPOs, in the workplace, collective farms, and neighborhoods. 3. in relation to the 1936 Constitution, the identification of freedom from exploitation, and thus socioeconomic well-being, as a core human right, along with proactive and substantive rights. 4. The inescapable and dialectical role of the leadership of the Communist Party in socialist democracy. These features would come to be developed much further by other socialist countries. The chapter also deals with the increasing usage of the term socialist state as a qualitatively different form of the state. The concern here is with Stalin's reflections in response to debates concerning the state's withering away, and his identification in an all-important speech to the 18th Congress of 1939 of a second stage of socialism, in which socialist state structures have attained relative maturity and stability. After summing up the features of such a socialist state, I address the contradiction in which the terminology of socialist state began to be deployed precisely when it was becoming clearer that the distinction between state and society was blurring and could no longer be applied. In short, the organs of governance were increasingly standing, as Engels already suggested, in the midst of society. Chapter 7. The Korean Style of Socialist Governance in the DPRK. With a focus on the Democratic Republic of Korea DPRK, this chapter signals the move to East Asia. Of potential case studies for analysis, why do I focus on the DPRK? Not only is it the most endearing of all the socialist countries, but it also has been the target of the greatest amount of Western caricatures and misrepresentations. In this case, it needs to be emphasized even more than that the agenda should not be set by external criticisms, but by those who actually know about the DPRK's system. My primary sources are Korean scholars, as well as a handful of observers who have actually visited the country and studied it carefully, as I have done on 2 research visits to the country. What do we find? The DPRK reveals a significant continuity in governance and political theory to other socialist countries, while at the same time revealing distinct emphases in its Korean style. The bulk of the chapter presents details on the practices of socialist governance, after providing some historical background to the emergence of the DPRK's governing structures. First is electoral democracy, which is embodied in the interaction between the People's Assemblies and the Democratic Front for the Reunification of the Fatherland. The Democratic Front includes all political parties, mass organizations, and religious groups, and it is here that multiple candidates for elections are put forward, debated, and selected. Only then do elections of the proposed candidates take place for the People's Assemblies, including the Supreme People's Assembly, which is the highest legislative body in the country. The second is consultative democracy, where the mass line comes to the fore. I analyze in some detail the Chongsan-ru method in agriculture and the Tai'an work system in industry, both named after the places where they were first developed. These methods entail a dialectical approach. The greater the substantive involvement of collective farmers and shop floor workers in problem solving and realistic planning, the more significant is the ownership and implementation of decisions and plans by the party committees and planning commissions. The third concerns the leadership of the Workers' Party of Korea, and here I use the example of the State Affairs Commission, SAC. The country's leader is the chair of the SAC, but not of the SPA and its standing committee, which has significant and wide-reaching powers. How does the SAC relate to the whole system of socialist democracy in the DPRK? It is accountable to the SPA, and the whole system, as one scholar puts it, regulates the order in which the state power is established and exercised. In other words, the significant power of the SAC requires not merely a high level of accountability, but also a robust system of statutory processes through which the WPK leads. The final part of the chapter provides an overview of political theory. Formally, this theory is embodied in 3 terms: Juche, or a people-first philosophy, in which the masses are masters of their destiny through the struggles of revolutionary construction, independence, and self-sufficiency. Songun, which arose in response to the immense challenges of the 1990s, and identifies the military as the prime revolutionary force that is able to drive economic recovery and preserve sovereignty. Kim Il-sungism, Kim Jong-ilism, as an integrated whole that is notably people-centered, emphasizing the creativity of the masses and the concern with improving everyday lives of common people. The chapter closes with some considerations on the unity of opposites. The terminology comes from dialectical materialism, with the unity in practice and ideology running through all levels of society and state, or as the Chondoist-inspired slogan puts it, believe in the people as in heaven. Chapter 8. China's Whole Process, People's Democracy. This chapter focuses on a speech by Xi Jinping from late 2021 concerning whole process, people's democracy. 全国城人民民主. It begins with an overview of the development of socialist democracy in China, from the beginnings with the anti-colonial struggle of the 19th century, through Mao Zedong's New Democracy, democratic dictatorship, and democratic centralism, to the full panoply of components that were established during the reform and opening up. The main concern is to identify the emphases in developing socialist democracy from the time of the CPC's 18th National Congress in 2012, and then the tasks at hand today. There are three main features that arise from this material. First is the importance of the mass line as the foundation of people's democracy, along with explicating the meaning of the people's heart or people's will in a socialist context, and the crucial role of democratic supervision. All of this may be seen in terms of the people as masters of the country. The second concerns a signature emphasis of Xi Jinping's tenure as General Secretary, developing further a comprehensive rule of law. On this topic, I provide a brief background to socialist rule of law before dealing with the project of strengthening the Constitution and the need for a robust and constantly updated legal system that focuses on incorporating the virtuous or good laws that are necessary for a socialist legal system. Third is the leadership of the Communist Party, without which socialist democracy would not exist. Here I focus on the development of rule of law, statutory procedures, through which the party's proposals become the will of the people, and how Xi Jinping has ensured the development of democratic centralism for countrywide governance. The conclusion to the chapter seeks to define socialist democracy in light of these three topics as a dialectical conjunction of Communist Party leadership and the people as masters of the country, mediated through the full range or whole process of democratic and rule of law statutory procedures. I also ask how democracy may be evaluated in any of its forms. A final note: this chapter is theoretical, but the three main topics, people's will, rule of law, and Communist Party leadership, will form the topics for case studies in the next three chapters. Chapter 9, The People's Will, Stability, Safety, and Harmony in Xinjiang. Arising from the three main themes of the previous chapter, people's will, rule of law, and Communist Party leadership, this chapter provides a case study relating to the people's heart, or will, as an inescapable feature of socialist democracy. It does so by focusing on a distinctive feature of China's socialist system in terms of the political and cultural assumptions of stability, safety, and harmony, and then analyzing the situation in relation to Xinjiang, Uyghur Autonomous Region. The first part provides an overview of the semantic fields of stability, safety, and harmony, and then pays more extensive attention to an important CPC Central Committee document from 2006 entitled Decision on Some Major Issues Concerning the Construction of a Harmonious Socialist Society. Coming in the wake of the wild 90s, the decision analyzes the many contradictions that had arisen and provides a full-spectrum policy response that has particular relevance for the many problems in Xinjiang. The second part of the chapter tackles the situation in Xinjiang in light of personal experience and scholarship. It begins with the presentation of two geographical features with immense strategic, political, and economic significance: the Hu-Huangyang Line and the He-Shi Corridor. This material sets the context for an overview of the historical development of the preferential policies for minority nationalities. The Uyghur nationality is one of 55 in China. After which I deal with the main emphases of these policies in terms of culture, education, governance, and economic development. The latter in particular had until recently lagged considerably in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, where poverty still remained a distinct problem in remote and rural areas. This leads me to deal with the Marxist approach to human rights, for which the core right is socioeconomic well-being and common prosperity. The residual poverty in Xinjiang has provided opportunities for the spread of Islamic radicalism in the 1990s, leading to a rise in terrorism, extremism, and separatism. The response has two related steps. First, a resolute focus in restoring stability, safety, and harmony through anti-terrorists and de-radicalization measures, tackling the root cause in terms of economic development, improving job training and opportunities, and education. Here I also address the patterns of growth in Xinjiang's population and the improved choices available to educated and working Uyghur women, as well as the profound effect of the Belt and Road Initiative, which has enabled Xinjiang at last to overcome absolute poverty and set out on the road to common prosperity. Only on the basis of high quality and balanced development are stability, safety, and harmony possible in the long term. Chapter 10. Governing the Country According to Law, the case of the Hong Kong storm. The second case study that arises from my treatment in Chapter 8 concerns the rule of law, with a particular focus on the Hong Kong National Security Law that was promulgated in June 2020 and came into effect at the beginning of 2021. I do not see the need to reprise my earlier treatments of rule of law itself, so I will address directly the situation of Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, SAR. The chapter begins with an overview of the longer history of Hong Kong as a part of China stolen by the British Empire in the 19th century and its development as a trade hub of all manner of commodities, legal and illegal, and use as a lever to destabilize the rest of China economically, politically, and culturally through religious missionaries. The second part deals with the long and complex negotiations of the 1980s and 1990s concerning Hong Kong's long overdue return to the mainland, with an emphasis on the continued obstructions by the British imperial negotiators. This leads to treatment of the innovative one country, two systems solution proposed by Deng Xiaoping, with reference to 3 SARs in Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan Island. Next, I move to the structural and economic problems of Hong Kong SAR since 1997, which developed a warped economy characterized by oligopoly capitalism, vast income disparities, sluggish economic growth, a polarized political landscape, and an educational system that sought to promote decaying Western liberal assumptions. These compound problems and tensions provided the causes of the Hong Kong storm that burst forth in 2019 to 2020, with unrest, riots, violence, and widespread destruction. This was also fanned by foreign interference that sought once again to use Hong Kong SAR as a destabilizing lever, now in terms of a color counter-revolution. The final part focuses on the comprehensive analysis and measures undertaken, including economic, political, educational, and media reform. Although my particular concern is with the Hong Kong National Security Law itself. This was a comprehensive rule of law solution to the immediate problems, and with effective implementation brought the unrest to a rapid end. The conclusion considers the longer-term goals of Hong Kong SAR's democratic reforms and economic development and indicates that the pioneering project of one country, two systems has already gained valuable experience for the time when Taiwan Island too becomes a special administrative region. Chapter 11. Party Building, Strengthening the Construction of a Marxist Party. The final case study that arises from Chapter 8 concerns party building, which is a key feature of effective leadership by the Communist Party. For a party of almost 100 million members. The level of organization for such an active communist party is beyond the imagination for those who live in countries with populations smaller than even the CPC. Building and strengthening the party, improving its theoretical knowledge in Marxism, leading on all fronts, building honest and clean governance, ensuring deep links with the masses, engaging actively with and deeply involved in communities and workplaces. These and many more are the tasks and responsibilities of party branches. The resources for these tasks are also immense, so I need to be selective. In this chapter, my interest is in local or grassroots party branches, since these are the foundations of the whole party. Attaching importance to and strengthening the construction of party branches is the distinctive feature of a Marxist party. The first part analyzes in some detail the regulations for the work of branches of the Communist Party of China, which was issued in trial form in 2018 and is currently undergoing comprehensive testing and the gathering of feedback from concrete experience. While providing an overview of the regulations, I am particularly interested in 5 topics. A. The dialectical nature of party branches in the sense that resolute and unified adherence to the Central Committee is coupled with full-scale democratic practices, energy, and creativity. B. The 10 types of party branches, which require some explanation and occasionally draws on personal experience. C. The tasks and responsibilities of such branches, especially since the regulations signaled a root and branch renewal of the base level, the very foundations of the CPC. D. Comprehensive democratic practices in terms of elections, consultation, and democratic supervision that has a spicy taste. E. And the increased responsibilities of party branch secretaries, which I leave for a separate section later in the chapter. The second section of the chapter selects one type of grassroots party branch out of a large number, the enterprise party branch. I do so by drawing on the immense resources at the premier site, Dangjian, which simply means party building. After a brief overview of the site's content and structure, I begin by analyzing some examples of branches in non-public enterprises before turning to the comprehensive Marxist educational activities of grassroots branches in state-owned enterprises. Since the centenary of the CPC was celebrated on the 1st of July 2021, the material I have researched primarily concerns historical study and activities in a number of different branches. The final topic of this section deals with the fact that the working masses, industrial workers, miners, railway employees, and so on, are the members of enterprise branches, and that a major responsibility concerns the well-being of the staff and working masses in the enterprise. The third and fourth sections concern the party branch secretary and the role of trade unions. The branch secretary is a major concern of the regulations, but I have held the treatment to this point since there has been a distinct focus on improving the skills and qualities of such secretaries. After dealing with the regulations on this matter, I turn to 2 insightful pieces, the first of which identifies the main problems that arose from appraisals of branch secretaries and the solutions in terms of identifying potential secretaries, nurturing and training them, and assisting branch secretaries in the many tasks of theoretical improvement, engagement with production and decision-making in the enterprise, and assisting branch members in all respects. The other study is an anonymous first-hand account of a new party branch secretary and the challenging tasks of renewing and growing the branch. The final section of the chapter broaches the topic of trade unions in a socialist system, especially since such a role is somewhat more difficult to understand for those who are accustomed to the antagonistic nature of class-based struggles in capitalist systems. Here I draw on a key document from the All-China Federation of Trade Unions, which should be a must-read text for all who are interested in the topic. Chapter 12, Conclusion, on Communism and the Common Good. The concluding chapter draws together the main insights that have arisen through this study, stressing the continuities and identifying the new developments. In doing so, I emphasize a number of points. First, it is clear that governance and the common good are inescapably connected. But how is the common good to be understood? For the Marxist tradition, and indeed for cultures in East Asia, the common good is primarily social, and it is only through the social that the individual may flourish. Second, how can the common good be fostered? The answer, from the history I have examined, is a strong and active state, albeit not one in the traditional sense. As Lacerdo has pointed out, this reality arose from contexts of either failed state conditions, Russia, or anti-colonial struggles for national liberation, Asia but also Africa. In these contexts, the state continues to be seen positively as a vital feature of all dimensions of socialist construction. Third, the reality of socialist political systems is an ongoing one. This should be obvious, but unlike the half-century of stagnation of Western nation-states, the nature of socialist governance is a work in process, a constantly elaborated and renewing tradition. It is in this sense that one may begin to understand the increasing confidence in countries such as China that the socialist political system has not merely a latent superiority in comparison to capitalist political systems, but that this latency is now becoming apparent and is being realized. End of Chapter 1. Socialism in Power by Roland BOER. Chapter 2. Marx on the State, Proletarian Dictatorship, and Commune. Opening remarks. The analysis of socialism in power must begin with Marx, even though we will find in the next chapter that Engels had far more to say on this question. Especially in dealing with the problems Marx was unable to solve. Indeed, the focus of this chapter is an unresolved contradiction in Marx's thought concerning what would happen to state power after a proletarian revolution. This is the contradiction between the proletarian dictatorship and the commune. To put it sharply, the dictatorship of the proletariat was to be centralizing, taking control of the forces of production, and comprehensively reshaping economics and society, and using strong and repressive measures to deal with the former ruling class and the inevitable counter-revolution. The commune, by contrast, was to be decentralizing, was opposed to repressive state power, and is imagined to be a free association of equal workers. The structure of the chapter is as follows. After a brief presentation of Marx's thought on hitherto existing forms of the state, I focus mostly on how Marx wrote of both the proletarian dictatorship and the commune, and how he offered a number of tentative suggestions as to how this contradiction might be resolved. In closing, I give detailed attention to Marx's fascinating struggle in dealing with the forms of governance under communism. He clearly realized that such governance is necessary, but he was also reticent to spell it out in detail. Why? He knew very well that he did not have the experience and thereby evidence to undertake a scientific study of what happens to the state under communism. A final introductory observation. By and large, studies of Marx's theory of the state, insofar as it can be pieced together, focus overwhelmingly on the capitalist state. While this is an understandable tendency in light of Marx's economic studies of capitalism, it also constitutes a retreat. Apart from an occasional sentence evoking Marx's somewhat euphoric description of the Paris Commune, there is very little indeed concerning what Marx had to say about the state after a proletarian revolution, let alone what governance in a socialist system might be. The reasons for such a retreat are many, but they are not my concern here. Instead, my interest is precisely on what Marx had to say about socialist governance, about socialism in power. Hitherto existing forms of the state. Marx's observations on forms of the state that have appeared in human history may be summarized in 5 key points, most of which would come to be developed more fully in the later work of Engels. See the next chapter. Key points on earlier state forms. First, The state is a product of the economic realities of modes of production, private property, division of labor, and especially classes and class conflict. Although Marx describes this ground as Bürgerliche Gesellschaft, bourgeois society, footnote 1, it is important to retain the terminology of the German Bürgerliche Gesellschaft, since it reminds us that Marx is speaking of bourgeois society. Unfortunately, the term is usually translated and thereby neutralized as civil society, even to the point of a later German back translation as Zivilgesellschaft. Crucially, for Hegel and Marx, this Bürgerliche Gesellschaft includes economic activity. Although in later developments of the concept the economy was excluded, although Marx already suggests that Hegel's formulae should be located in the hybrid situation of the Prussian Empire, where a bourgeois state had not yet emerged, in the German ideology he and Engels specify, the term Bürgerliche Gesellschaft emerged in the 18th century, when property relations had already extricated themselves from the ancient and medieval community. Bürgerliche Gesellschaft, as such, only develops with the bourgeoisie. For a detailed analysis of the terminology in the works of Marx and Engels, see my earlier study. End of footnote 1. In the Critique of Hegel, footnote 2. In the Critique of Hegel, Marx returns to this point repeatedly, and it also appears in the Holy Family. For a detailed assessment of Marx's intense engagement with Hegel, see Leopold, 2007, pages 17 through 99. End of footnote 2. Already by the first rough outline of historical materialism in the German ideology, a class-based economic analysis emerges. Footnote. The state that arises from class struggle became an assumed position, appearing frequently in later works. End of footnote. In sum, hitherto existing forms of the state are the products of class struggle, which would become a core Marxist position. Second, the dominant class determines the nature of the state. This determination may be more direct, as the manifesto puts it, the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. Footnote. The German ideology on at least one occasion tends in this direction. The state is the form in which the individuals of a ruling class assert their common interests. This approach is sometimes labeled instrumentalists, but this is a misleading simplification. End of footnote. Or the determination may be indirect, since the class in question may not be, due to internal contradictions and tensions, always in immediate control. Yet this class's systemic framework sets the terms for all acts and policies. This emphasis comes to the fore particularly in Marx's analysis in the 18th Brumaire, where he observes that while Louis Napoleon was trying to break the bourgeoisie's political power at the same time by protecting their material power, he generates anew their public and political power. Footnote. As the German ideology observes, the social power of a ruling class has its practical idealistic expression in each case in the form of the state, meaning that their power must be constituted as the state. Emphasis in the original, this point arises out of a detailed polemic against Max Stirner's approach to the state and private property and law in the crucial long chapter on Stirner in which Marx and Engels first developed the rudiments of historical materialism. For useful outlines of and engagements with Stirner's philosophy, see Baser, 2011, and Leopold, 2006. End of footnote. I will have more to say on this study by Marx below. But we may note here the way working-class political parties within capitalist systems must inevitably conform to the structures of the capitalist state already established by the bourgeoisie. Third, the state is separated from and relates to society in an antagonistic manner. This position already appears in the Critique of Hegel. In short, Hegel, presents everywhere the conflict between bourgeois society and the state. Throughout the study of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx emphasizes this point again and again, coming to focus especially on the Jewish question, on the internationalization of this struggle in terms of the tension between being a private individual and the citizen of a state. Related is the fourth point. Since the state is separated from bourgeois society, by which Marx meant economic and social forces, the state has a degree of autonomy that varies in light of specific conditions. This autonomy may be encapsulated in two observations, one concerning the French absolute monarchy as an executive power, with its enormous bureaucratic and military organization that had complex forms of representation and transformation, and the other concerning bourgeois or vulgar democracy as the last form of state, bourgeois society, in which the class struggle has to be fought out to a conclusion. These points may be summarized in a sentence or two. Hitherto existing forms of the state have arisen from the socio-economic realities of class struggle and are determined by the class in power. These forms of the state are separated from, have various degrees of autonomy from, and relate antagonistically with society, bourgeois society, in the case of the capitalist state. These points are quite well known, and I see no need to elaborate further. Despite the tendency of Marxist analyses in Western contexts to restrict analysis to the capitalist or bourgeois state. Historical emergence of the bourgeois state. Of more interest here is the fact that Marx has a preference for historical narratives, each of which has its own variations. Yet all of these historical accounts seek to show how the bourgeoisie came to dominate the new state form in Europe. The first example appears in On the Jewish Question, with its manifold dialectical turns and intriguing historical shifts. The immediate context is Marx's response to Bruno Bauer's claim that political emancipation would be achieved when people have dispensed with their particular religious claims, when the Christian state was abolished, and a thoroughly secular and atheistic state established. Marx replies by arguing that the Christian state, the final form of the absolutist state after the Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, does not disappear with the secular bourgeois state, but that the bourgeois state is the full dialectical realization of the Christian state. In order to make this point, Marx turns not to France or elsewhere in Europe, but to the United States of America. A curious move, since the United States never experienced the absolutist state, let alone the final phase of the latter, as the Christian state. It may have begun as a white supremacist racial state based on genocide and slavery, but an absolutist state in the European sense it was not. Marx's move may well be due to the fact that the United States was seen by many in Europe as a harbinger of the future precisely because it did not seem to have a history comparable to Europe. Marx is not so enthused, pointing out that in the United States religion had become a private affair, exercised by any citizen, while the state itself was ostensibly secular. This is the full resolution of the contradictions of the absolutist Christian state, which is actually not Christian at all. Instead, the fully realized Christian state is the atheistic state, the democratic state, the state which relegates religion to a place among other elements of bourgeois society. Or, as the Holy Family puts it, the politically perfected modern state that knows no religious privileges is also the fully developed Christian state. A second and relatively brief example appears in the German ideology, although here we move into territory that was to become Engels's forte. See the next chapter. The narrative here suggests that the state may have been relatively independent under feudal or absolutist forms, and it remained so to an unprecedented level in the hybrid situation in Prussia of that time, due to the inability of one class to attain dominance. As the bourgeoisie slowly gained wealth and power, and as the state became increasingly indebted, the state lost its independence and became subject to the bourgeoisie, and so a bourgeois state. Third is the relatively brief account in the manifesto, which provides greater complexity concerning the various alliances undertaken by the European bourgeoisie as its power grew. Originally oppressed under feudalism, it began to achieve self-governance in scattered medieval communes or in urban republics. Then it moved to being a third estate, French monarchy, and a cornerstone of absolute monarchies, in opposition to the nobility. Only with a world capitalist market was the bourgeoisie able to conquer exclusive political sway through the modern representative state, which now manages its common affairs. The longest account appears in the 18th Brumaire, where Marx argues that the bourgeoisie does not need to exercise direct power to promote its agenda. It can gain and lose parliamentary control or act as an executive for a late imperial pretender, Louis Napoleon, who was an apparent champion of the peasants and the lumpen proletariat, while at the same time ensuring that the form of the state emerged secured the growth of capital and profit. At a crucial moment, the opposition between state power and society becomes crystal clear, and this is when the bourgeoisie can achieve its goal. Marx describes this eventual achievement, riven with contradictions, as the unlimited despotism of one class over other classes, the interweaving in closest fashion of the extensive state machine with the material interests of the French bourgeoisie, and the centralization of the state that modern society requires. Footnote: for an insightful analysis of the complexities of this text, see Jessup, 2007, 883 to 100, for a comparable account of the trials and tribulations of the bourgeoisie in relation to the state under Napoleon Bonaparte, leading to its political enlightenment. See the Holy Family. End of footnote. The final example appears in the Civil War in France, in a section where Marx attempts to provide some background for the Paris Commune. Here, he writes specifically of state power, emphasizing the increasing centralization and repressive nature of this power. Initially, the absolutist state, with its centralization in terms of a standing army, police, bureaucracy, clergy, and judiciary, was a mighty weapon in the hands of the bourgeoisie against feudalism. Footnote: since this text was originally published in English, I cite only the English version. End of footnote. In the bourgeois state that followed after the French Revolution, state power fully reveals its repressive face. Footnote: duly stressed by Polanczas, 1969, page 76, although he skips the repressive role of the dictatorship of the proletariat. End of footnote. Thus, a parliamentary system means direct control by the propertied classes, which enabled class terrorism and a national war engine of capital against labor, even though the bourgeoisie was subsequently driven out of direct control of power during the phases of the French Empire, and indeed Prussian Empire. It became even more adept at advancing its agenda even when not in direct control. As noted earlier, Louis Napoleon simply could not avoid a spate of policies that strengthened the economic and indeed systemic power of the bourgeoisie. Thus, imperialism is both the most prostitute and the ultimate form of state power, which full-grown bourgeois society had finally transformed into a means for the enslavement of labor by capital. To sum up, these historical narratives touch on each of the points identified earlier, but they move in a clear direction: the bourgeoisie's final ability to set the agenda for the state, thereby determining the state's nature. This agenda is implicitly economic, securing the many dimensions of the state to ensure the dominance of capital. Although Marx tends not to spell out the details. Crucially, this dominance does not need to entail direct hold on political power, since the bourgeoisie had learnt, through its long emergence, that it could achieve the desired effect indirectly. Policies such as uniform weights and measures, exchangeable currencies, effective border control, efficient policing, communication, and infrastructure would ensure the secure transport of goods across countries. By the time we come to the farce of the reign of Louis Bonaparte, he simply could not avoid instituting more and more measures to ensure the bourgeoisie's economic and political dominance. Given that the very nature and purpose of the bourgeois state is to exploit the proletariat, it should be no surprise that Marx would later conclude that the proletariat cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. Footnote: or, as Marx and Engels put it in a review of the bourgeois socialism of Girardin, quote, "The bourgeois state is nothing more than the mutual insurance of the bourgeois class against its individual members as well as against the exploited class, insurance which will necessarily become increasingly expensive and to all appearances increasingly independent of bourgeois society because the oppression of the exploited class is becoming ever more difficult." End quote. End of footnote. Dictatorship of the proletariat. Since it is clearly impossible to take over the state form of capitalism in the context of a socialist system, a question arises: what is to take its place? Marx's theoretical answer entails two proposals that sit rather uncomfortably with one another: the dictatorship of the proletariat and the commune. In what follows, I deal first with the proletarian dictatorship and then with the commune, after which I examine Marx's unresolved struggles in relating the two. The first mention of the dictatorship of the working class or proletariat was in a series of articles published in the Neo-Rheinische Zeitung from January to October in 1850, although we have come to know the collated articles as the class struggle in France from 1848 to 1850. This was the title proposed by Engels after he had gathered the articles, wrote an introduction, and added a fourth chapter of his own, and saw to the publication of the whole as a book. I will have more to say concerning the circumstances of this process of editing and publication below, since here I focus on the key propositions concerning the proletarian dictatorship, with the majority of citations coming from this work by Marx. Footnote: since the text now appears in critical editions in light of cross-checking between the Neo-Rheinische Zeitung and the book of 1895, I cite the text from these critical editions. End of footnote. A few references will also be made to some works from 1871 to 1875 in the context of the struggles with Bakunin and the anarchists. Main features of the proletarian dictatorship. To begin with, the need for a dictatorship of the proletariat arises in response to bourgeois dictatorship or bourgeois terrorism, which perpetuates the rule of capital and the slavery of labor. Hence the slogan, overthrow of the bourgeoisie, dictatorship of the working class. In other words, the proletarian dictatorship is the revolt against the bourgeois dictatorship and thereby a change of society. Footnote: class conflict must attain a high level before a revolutionary dictatorship can be seized. End of footnote. Further, the concern of the proletarian dictatorship is both economic and political, the appropriation of the means of production, their subjection to the associated working class. The purpose is to overcome exploitation and ensure the economic well-being of the majority of urban and rural workers, since the proletarian dictatorship is the means to achieve the abolition of all the relations of production on which class distinctions rest, the abolition of all the social relations that correspond to these relations of production, to the revolutionizing of all the ideas that result from these social relations. Of necessity, the dictatorship of the proletariat is repressive of the small minority that comprised the former ruling class. As a joint statement of the Universal Society of Revolutionary Communists put it at the same time, this entails the submission of the privileged classes and indeed the counter-revolution, since the dictatorship of the proletarians is to keep the revolution in continual progress until the achievement of communism. Footnote: note also the representation put in the mouths of Proudhonists. If the political struggle of the working class assumes violent forms, and if the workers replace the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie class with their own revolutionary dictatorship. End of footnote. More sharply, in the manifesto, we find that the proletariat as a ruling class sublates by violent force the old conditions of production. Gewaltsam is the crucial word, bearing the senses of violence, force, and power. Footnote: see the detailed treatment of this term in Friedrich Engels and the Foundations of Socialist Governance. End of footnote. Indeed, in his later notes on Bakunin, Marx uses the word 3 times. The proletariat must use violent, gewaltsam means. The economic conditions that give rise to class struggle must be cleared from the road or transformed by violent force. Footnote: the metaphorical phrase aus dem Weg räumen has a number of senses in German, turning on clearing something off the road, removing obstacles from the road, clearing a barrier, and so eliminating, ironing out, doing away with, and sweeping away. Political resonances run through the phrase. End of footnote. And the process of transformation must be accelerated by violent force. Footnote. Translations mine. A few pages later, Marx mentions the general means of coercion in its struggle. End of footnote. The proletarian dictatorship also has a strong centralizing force. In a joint letter to the press from 1850, the section penned by Marx directly connects his comments on the dictatorship of the proletariat with the measures outlined in the manifesto of the Communist Party. So let us see what the manifesto proposes, with a particular focus on the 10 points that may be regarded as a preliminary program for what is to happen immediately after a successful proletarian revolution. Footnote: for reference, the 10 points are as follows. 1. Abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. 2. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax. 3. Abolition of all right of inheritance. 4. Confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. 5. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. 6. Centralization of the means of communication and transport in the heads of the state. 7. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. 8. Equal liability of all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. 9. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. 10. Free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production. End of footnote. Not only does the manifesto include repressive measures against the former ruling class and counter-revolutionary efforts, but it also clearly stresses the need for centralized measures. All of the 10 points require strong governance. But note in particular the centralization and indeed monopoly of communication, transport, and of credit in a national bank. The abolition of private property in land and inheritance. The control and expansion of agriculture and industry as the instruments of production owned by the state. The establishment of labor armies. And the equal liability of all adults to labor. In short, it entails the state's centralized ownership of the means of production and thus control over the forces of production. Footnote. And as Critique of the Gotha program indicates in dealing with the transitional first phase of communism, inequality would have to be the norm precisely for the sake of overcoming economic inequality. Right would have to be unequal rather than equal. End of footnote. Finally, the proletarian dictatorship is transitional. As the class struggles in France 1848 to 1850 puts it, revolutionary socialism is the declaration of the permanence of the revolution, the class dictatorship of the proletariat as the necessary transition point to the abolition of class distinctions generally. Footnote. Or, as Marx puts it in a letter to Wedemeyer, my own contribution was one to show that the existence of classes is merely bound up with certain historical phases in the development of production. 2. That the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. 3. That this dictatorship itself constitutes no more than a transition to the Aufhebung of all classes and to a classless society. End of footnote. Or, as Critique of the Gotha program observes, between capitalist and communist society is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. This is the same as what Marx calls the first or initial stage of communism, although no time frame is indicated. To sum up, the dictatorship of the proletariat is absolutely necessary for dealing with the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, which inescapably entails repression of the former ruling class and counter-revolutionary forces. It also exercises a process of centralization with a distinct focus on economic and political measures, and it is clearly transitional. Analysis. A number of items need some further analysis, but first I need to address the important time lag and the impact of what we now know as the class struggles in France 1848 to 1850. As mentioned earlier, the initial articles were published in 1850, and there was also a joint statement by the Universal Society of Revolutionary Communists, at the same time that mentioned the dictatorship of the proletariat. After these appearances, there was a gap of about 2 decades before the term re-emerged. During the intense struggles with Bakunin and the anarchists over the composition and direction of the First International, the real impact of Marx's initial deployment of the proletarian dictatorship was in the first half of the 1890s. Marx was already dead, so it fell to Engels to tackle the moderating wing of the massive German Social Democratic Party, and especially its representatives in the Reichstag. Under relentless pressure from more centrist and right-wing political parties, and driven by a desire to present a more acceptable face of the Social Democrats in the wake of the anti-socialist laws. This wing began to downplay revolution and the proletarian dictatorship. As we will see in the next chapter, Engels would have nothing of the sort. While fully acknowledging the need to be attuned to what would be effective in a particular time and place, Engels marshaled his energies to insist on the centrality of a proletarian revolution and the ensuing dictatorship of the proletariat. So, he dusted off Marx's notes on the Gotha program and ensured their publication, wrote a number of pieces himself, and, as mentioned, undertook the republication of the 1850 essays by Marx, now in book form and with the title The Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850. By now, the terms initially used more than 4 decades earlier took on a whole new importance. The communist movement needed to persist with the dictatorship of the working class and the class dictatorship of the proletariat. This increased emphasis on the proletarian dictatorship as a core feature of socialist governance also raises a couple of questions. The first concerns centralization, repression of the former ruling class, and violent force. Commentators have at times been troubled by this clear emphasis by Marx, suggesting that by dictatorship Marx meant rule or workers' democracy, or following the moderating tendency against which Engels had already struggled by skipping past the proletarian dictatorship and emphasizing the Paris Commune. Footnote: for a good number of Western Marxists, the moderating desire is part and parcel of truncating Marxism by cutting off Engels and the whole tradition that followed, from Lenin to Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping. End of footnote. That such a dictatorship is necessary is clear from Marx's texts, especially for the sake of overcoming the counter-revolution embodied in the bourgeois dictatorship. Footnote. The dictatorship of the proletariat was clearly not Blancist, for which the dictatorship in question is not by the proletariat but by a small band of dedicated revolutionaries over the proletariat. End of footnote. But should it also involve violent force? Earlier, I translated Gewaltsam as with violent force, simply because it is the core of the semantic field of the German term. Further, Marx's use of the word on 3 consecutive occasions in his critique of Bakunin's statism and anarchy has a rhetorical effect that intensifies the senses of force or violence and power. The risk of opting for a slightly softer force, common in translations, is that it feeds into the moderating tendency that has been a problem since at least the 1890s. A further question concerns the relationship found in Critique of the Gotha program between the transitional phase of the proletarian dictatorship and the first and higher phases of communist society. Marx's comments are brief, deliberately so for reasons that will become clear later, but the question remains, what is the relationship between these two proposals? One possible interpretation is that Marx was suggesting an initial phase, which he called the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that this would be followed by at least 2 subsequent stages within communism itself. The problem is that such an interpretation requires importing a significant amount of extra material, leaving us with 3 phases rather than the 2 Marx mentions. Another and more natural interpretation is possible, which is that the proletarian dictatorship and the first stage of communism are the same. Thus, the first phase is not communist society, developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect, economically, morally, and intellectually, still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. Marx writes of certain defects, such as unequal bourgeois right, differences between individuals that entail division of labor, recompense in terms of labor, and the existence of commodities defects that are inevitable in the first phase of communist society, as it is when it has just emerged after prolonged birth pangs from capitalist society. Only in the higher phase can one speak of the gradual disappearance of the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and thereby also the antithesis between mental and physical labor, entailing that class distinctions still exist in the first phase. Footnote. Marx makes matters more complicated by observing that in the first phase, unequal bourgeois right recognizes no class distinctions. Does he mean that classes as such do not exist, or that bourgeois right does not recognize classes in its operation? The latter seems the more likely sense, especially in light of Marx's comments on the continued reality of inequality and that division of labor disappears only with the higher phase of communist society. End of footnote. For these reasons, I have followed a more natural interpretation of the text, in which the first phase, which has just emerged from capitalist society and is still stamped with it in so many ways, is to be equated with the revolutionary transformation from capitalist society to communist society, which is also a political transition period that Marx calls the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. But it must be acknowledged that Marx's comments are sparse and purely theoretical, and that his observations on the phases of communism and the proletarian dictatorship are separated by a number of pages, thereby leaving open the possibility of a range of interpretations. The Commune. Given the centralized, repressive, and violently forceful nature of the proletarian dictatorship, economically and politically, in Marx's texts, his enthusiasm concerning the Paris Commune produces a notable tension in his thoughts on the nature of governance after a communist revolution. But before analyzing this tension, let me identify the main points concerning the Commune. Marx's presentation of the Paris Commune. Marx's much-studied observations on the Paris Commune appear in a few pages of The Civil War in France, which was originally published in English. To begin with, the very new political form of the Commune requires the overcoming of the old form of state power, which entails moving the functions of governance from the state to the communes. Marx speaks of the legitimate functions and indeed the whole initiative hitherto exercised by the state being put in the hands of, discharged by, and restored to the responsible agents of society. Footnote. In the notes on Bakunin's Statism and Anarchy, Marx speaks of the way elections are determined by the economic foundations, with the removal of patterns of economic exploitation. He writes that the distribution of general functions has become a routine matter, which entails no domination. End of footnote. Further, this appropriation has a number of dimensions, such as a. Moving from a non-representative bourgeois parliamentary system to a working body executive and legislative at the same time, for which elections are local, direct, and revocable. B. Suppressing the standing army and substitution by a national guard comprised of working people. C. Stripping the police of political attributes and making them into responsible and revocable agents of the commune. D. Divesting the judiciary of sham independence and ensuring it is elected. These changes in the commune entailed decentralization, with the old centralized government giving way to the self-government of the producers, a model replicated in even the smallest hamlet. They also entailed breaking the mechanisms of repression, whether police, army, judiciary, or the spiritual force of repression embodied in the church and education. Finally, the focus in Marx's observations on the commune are almost exclusively concerned with changes in the structures of governance, with little concerning economic measures. All we find are general observations concerning a working-class government for the sake of the emancipation of labor, a lever for uprooting the economical foundations upon which rests the existence of classes and therefore of class rule. Since everyone becomes a worker, and the workers express the only true hopes of the peasants, labor ceases to be a class attribute. Indeed, Marx emphasizes that the commune was above all a thoroughly expansive political form. Footnote. The first draft also offers only brief and general observations on economic matters. End of footnote. In sum, Marx's observations on the Paris Commune focus almost entirely on its political transformations, with an emphasis on decentralization and overcoming repression, and the free association of workers. Not unexpectedly, the Commune has, through Marx's observations, become the ideal model, especially among Western Marxists, for what should happen after a proletarian revolution and the exercise of power. However, the representation of the Commune raises more questions than it solves. Limits of the Commune. The Paris Commune was the only concrete experience, brief and limited as it was, from which either Marx or Engels could draw any insights or lessons at all. Some had participated and escaped the slaughter thereafter, but Marx and Engels had to engage remotely, assessing what could be learned from afar. Further, the Commune was the first concrete opportunity to test the policies of various revolutionary organizations, especially Proudhonists, Blanquists, and Communists, but it would come to be seen, especially by Engels, see the next chapter, as a very preliminary exercise of proletarian power, and one that went by no means far enough in its measures. Further, Marx's observations on the Paris Commune echo an earlier line of thought with a relatively positive and Enlightenment-inspired perception of human nature. Thus, in texts from the mid-1840s, Marx writes of the alienation produced by the division of labor, of the patterns of domination and exploitation embodied in class structures, and the concomitant patterns of the bourgeois state that had to be overcome by removing the causes of this alienation and reuniting the broken parts of human existence. At one point, Marx calls this reunited individual existence human emancipation. Footnote. Note also, quote, thus they find themselves directly opposed to the form in which hitherto the individuals of which society consists have given themselves collective expression, that is, the state. In order, therefore, to assert themselves as individuals, they must overthrow the state. End quote. Marx and Engels, 1846. See further Leopold's detailed investigation, 2007. End of footnote. Perhaps the best image of this human emancipation appears in the first rough outline of historical materialism. Quote, communist society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. End quote. Marx and Engels, 1846. As Harding points out, this image with touches of agrarian anti-industrial socialism does not present one working as a collier, fitter, assembly worker, and salesman. Of course, the notable shift with the Paris Commune is that it was precisely the workers of Paris that were the focus, but the risk is that Marx's depiction may drift away into well-nigh utopian images of a free association of workers. This is especially the case if one downplays the equally important role of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Proletarian dictatorship and the Commune. When we consider the proletarian dictatorship and the Commune in relation to one another, we encounter a notable tension. One draws together economic and political factors and is focused on appropriating the means of production and controlling the forces of production, while the other treads lightly on economic matters. One is clearly centralized and repressive of the former ruling class, while the other seeks to overcome the centralization and repression of state power. In short, one stipulates strong measures to overcome bourgeois dictatorship and the expected counter-revolution, while the other explores the internal workings of the Association of Equal Workers, which was soon defeated by the counter-revolution. Footnote. The commentators who actually recognize this tension are few. End of footnote. Apart from the fact that it would fall to Engels to make an initial effort to solve this tension, the question remains, was Marx aware of the tension, if not outright contradiction? While Marx never explicitly equated the proletarian dictatorship with the Commune, which was to be Engels's solution. Footnote. In his introduction to the third edition of Marx's The Civil War in France, Engels writes, do you want to know what this dictatorship looks like? Look at the Paris Commune. That was the dictatorship of the proletariat. End of footnote. A few hints suggest that he was aware of the problem and that he made some initial steps to understand their relationship. Footnote. Harding speculatively suggests that Marx was perhaps embarrassed by the tension and studiously avoided identifying the Commune with the dictatorship of the proletariat. Note further that in Critique of the Gotha Program, Marx was quite scathing of the old democratic litany familiar to all: universal suffrage, direct legislation, popular rights, a people's militia, etc. This, Marx suggests, is a mere echo of the bourgeois People's Party, of the League of Peace and Freedom. End of footnote. To begin with, let us return to the point that the dictatorship of the proletariat is a transitional form from capitalism to communism. There are two risks as how we may understand this transitional phase. The first risk is to assume that the proletarian dictatorship is to be a relatively brief period. deploying the old machinery of the state to crush the bourgeois dictatorship and deal with the inevitable counter-revolution. Footnote. Some earlier material by Marx moves in this direction while not yet mentioning the proletarian dictatorship. Marx speaks of restricting the destruction and dissolution to the revolutionary process itself without following a period for the establishment of the working class rule and the need to deal with the counter-revolution. Instead, after the revolution, socialism throws off its political cloak. Emphasis in original. End of footnote. In short, it is seen as part of the initial revolutionary seizure of power and should, subsequently, fall away. The second risk is that the proletarian dictatorship becomes the actual form of state power under socialism, and that it should entail the elimination of classes. Chinese Marxist scholarship has been particularly attentive to this question, since their analysis takes place within the context of a socialist system under construction. Footnote. The dates of these Chinese Marxist studies are significant. In the debate of the first decade of the 2000s, there was a concerted effort to come to terms with the slogan deployed during the leftist deviation of the Cultural Revolution. Continuous revolution of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The debate was resolved when it became clear that the proletarian dictatorship should not be dropped and should not be universalized, but properly understood. End of footnote. Here we find an emphasis on the transitional nature of the proletarian dictatorship, an awareness from actual experience that the transition period may take longer than some may have expected, but especially that it is not the actual state form of socialism and certainly does not entail the complete elimination of classes. In sum, the dictatorship of the proletariat functions as a political guarantee of the transition from capitalist society to a communist society. Does this mean that we need to wait for the proletarian dictatorship to do its work so as to enable the commune to emerge, or rather, what is the nature of the commune in this respect? Is it to be equated with communism as such? 3 texts from the first half of the 1870s indicate that Marx was beginning to see that such a neat distinction is untenable, since the commune itself would need to exercise the proletarian dictatorship for the sake of its very survival. The first text is a letter to Ludwig Kugelmann from 1871, in which Marx is full of praise for the initiative and bravery of the communards. However, he observes that it is not sufficient to transfer the bureaucratic military machine from one hand to another, but to break it, and that is essential for every real people's revolution on the continent. Marx continues, although the commune was attempting to do this, it made 2 mistakes. It did not march on Versailles immediately, thus dealing with the counter-revolution, and the Central Committee surrendered its power too soon to make way for the commune. While the proletarian dictatorship is not mentioned explicitly in the letter to Kugelmann, it does appear in the second text, a speech of a few months later, where Marx makes the same point. We need to be a little wary here, since all we have of the speech is a report that paraphrases Marx's words at a celebration of the Internationale's 7th anniversary in 1871. According to the report, Marx said that while the Commune sought to remove the conditions for oppression by transferring the means of production to the laborer, note the economic focus here, and thereby bring to an end class society, before such a change could be effected, a proletarian dictator would become necessary, and the first condition of that was a proletarian army. Indeed, the working classes would have to conquer the right to emancipate themselves on the battlefield. The suggestion in both the letter to Kugelmann and in the speech at the 7th anniversary of the International, both in 1871, is that the Commune should itself enact the proletarian dictatorship to the full, so as to crush the forces of reaction and counter-revolution. In other words, by the early 1870s, Marx was beginning to see the necessary connection between the proletarian dictatorship and the Commune. We may see this relationship in terms of an effort to specify a dialectically interconnected historical narrative in which both must be present so as to enable the full realization of the Commune itself. Footnote. In light of the fuller realization of a socialist rule of law, some more recent Chinese research sees the stipulations concerning the Commune as a form of restriction and supervision of the power of the proletarian dictatorship. End of footnote. This is indeed the concern of the third text, the commentary on Bakunin's Statehood and Anarchy, where Marx indicates that the centralization already outlined in the manifesto would require coercion, force, and violence during the initial phase when the old economic forms persist, along with the associated class dynamics and political forms. Here we find that the repressive coercion of the proletarian dictatorship is precisely the means for sublating the old economic basis, and thereby the proletariat's old character as a class. Only when this situation has finally been achieved can the methods used for achieving it be discarded. It is in this light that we should understand the observations in Critique of the Gotha Program, see above, where the dictatorship of the proletariat is coterminous with the initial stage of communism, and that the further stage would begin to see the unfolding of full communism. Footnote. Although Balabar reads a little too much of Lenin's thought into that of Marx and Engels, he does stress this particular point. End of footnote. Before turning to the question as to what happens to the state, we should note that Marx sees both the proletarian dictatorship and the commune as very much works in progress. While one is a transitional means, he observes in relation to the commune that one should not expect miracles or ready-made utopias, but rather be prepared for long struggles, historical processes, and the need to transform both circumstances and human beings. A crucial aspect of these struggles is dealing with counter-revolution. The proletarian dictatorship was geared to deal with such matters, but even with the commune, Marx notes that it existed as a besieged town, only to suffer too soon the deception and savagery of the old order based at Versailles. On socialist governance, what happens to the state under the dictatorship of the proletariat and the commune? Marx was drawn to deal with this question in the 1870s in the wake of the Paris Commune's demise and the struggle with Bakunin and the anarchists in the International. Marx offers a few suggestions, but it is clear that his energy was waning by that time, or at least that his energies were directed to other matters, while Engels would offer a much fuller answer. See the next chapter. My concern here is with Marx's suggestions. The dictatorship of the proletariat was a relatively straightforward question, since it clearly exercises the activities or functions of what would normally be connected with a strong state. I think less here of the way it should use the mechanisms of existing state structures to prosecute its self-abolishing agenda, but more in terms of the implications that arise in light of Marx's historical arguments that the nature of the state is determined by the class in control. If the workers and peasants are in control during a transitional period of proletarian dictatorship, does not the state begin to change its nature? Indeed, can we still speak of a state as it had thus far been defined? The commune posed more of a problem for Marx, for here he equivocates, or at least he does so between the earlier drafts and the final form of the Civil War in France. In the first draft, Marx writes that the commune was not a revolution against this or that legitimate constitutional, republican, or imperialist form of state power. Instead, it was a revolution against the state itself, this supernaturalist abortion of society, a resumption by the people, for the people, of its own social life. The state, per se, is separate and independent from society, being the machinery of class domination by its very definition. In this light, it matters not which form of the state appears, for each is essentially the same, and against the state as such the commune becomes a Hegelian negation. Notably, in the second and especially the final version of the Civil War in France, Marx drops the sentence concerning the revolution against the state itself. Footnote, those who quote this text as a supposedly definitive statement of Marx's approach to the state after a proletarian revolution neglect to specify that it comes from the first draft of the Civil War in France and was later dropped in the second draft and final version, end of footnote, and his writing becomes more considered, specifying state power and delineating clearly the commune's exercise of certain governing functions that are directly responsible to the people. In fact, Marx had also mentioned in the first draft that state functions are reduced to a few functions for general national purposes, and it was precisely this feature that would come to the fore in the final version of the text. Footnote. Note also that the first draft speaks of the reabsorption of the state power by society as its own living forces instead of as forces controlling and subduing it by the popular masses themselves, forming their own force instead of the organized force of their suppression. End of footnote. In other words, Marx seems to have realized that the flourish of the first draft was by no means realistic, and indeed drifted in an anarchist direction. Instead, the commune itself had in fact exercised a number of governing functions. In two other works from the 1870s, Marx offers a few intriguing suggestions concerning the nature of these governing functions. In Critique of the Gotha Program, he tackles the question of the free state proposed by the German Workers' Party. Three features of Marx's response are relevant. To begin with, he reiterates the position, well established in his work by now, that existing society is the basis of the existing state, and that the state in question is not an independent entity. Here, he adds a crucial parenthetical comment, or of the future state, in the case of future society. Footnote. Quotations in this paragraph are drawn from a couple of pages in Critique of the Gotha Program. End of footnote. In other words, any form of the state in future society would also be shaped by that society. Next, he points out that while present states manifest significant variety, they have in common the fact that they are based on modern bourgeois society. But what is the reason for the variety? They are more or less capitalistically developed, by which he means that they are more or less free from medieval admixture and influenced by particular historical developments. Thus, even capitalist society, depending on the complexities of local histories, is in various stages of transition between feudalism and capitalism in a European context. And this is so after hundreds of years of capitalist development. Will this also be the case in any future society until at last the present root bourgeois society will have died off? The final point returns to the nature of governance in the future, after a proletarian revolution and during the long task of socialist construction. Marx asks, what transformation will the state undergo in communist society? He then reframes the question. In other words, what social functions will remain in existence there that are analogous to present state functions? These reflections are obviously in a similar vein to those of the Civil War in France of a few years before. Even in a communist society, distinct social functions will be required that are analogous to present state functions, or rather, Marx raises the question without offering an answer. The reason is that he does not have the actual data, the experience of constructing a communist society after a revolution. As he observes, the question can be answered only scientifically. Now, some ambivalence creeps into Marx's texts. Having raised the question above and having refused an answer, he then mentions the transition period and the dictatorship of the proletariat. We are left wondering when he mentions communist society earlier, with its social functions analogous to present-day state functions, hinting at a qualitatively distinct form of governance that arises from communist society. Does he mean this first and transitional stage, however long it may be? Footnote. Draper, 1970, opts for this answer based on a comment made much earlier in the text concerning communist society, not as it has developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society. However, in the passage here under analysis, Marx leaves the possibilities more open than Draper admits. End of footnote. Or does he mean the full realization of communism when bourgeois society has completely disappeared? The other text, Marx's commentary on Bakunin, is one we have already encountered on a number of occasions in this chapter. Earlier I noted the strong language in terms of the proletarian dictatorship and the beginnings of a dialectical approach in which the aforesaid dictatorship is required for the commune itself. Here, I am interested in Marx's struggle to find an adequate terminology concerning the nature of governance that is to follow. In a series of responses to Bakunin's questions, Marx makes the following pertinent points. In order to achieve self-governance of the communities, one still needs an executive. Footnote. The quotations in the remainder of the paragraph are drawn from a few insightful pages of the notes on Bakunin. End of footnote. Take the example of a trades union where an executive administers the common interests. Obviously, such a situation entails division of labor. This is not to say that a worker ceases to be a worker when elected to an executive, in the same way that a factory owner today does not cease to be a capitalist when he becomes a municipal councilor. But what is the function of elections? They are not progressive in and of themselves, for they depend on the economic foundations, if not the economic interrelations, of the voters. Thus, as soon as the functions are no longer political, 1. The government functions no longer exist. 2. The distribution of general functions has become a routine matter which entails no domination. 3. Elections lose their present political character. Clearly, Marx is struggling at this point. On the one hand, he asserts the absence of government functions and political character, the latter meaning the manifestation of class struggle in the antagonistic politics of the state. Footnote, as the Communist Manifesto observes, political Gewalt, properly so called, is merely the organized Gewalt of one class for oppressing another, or as the misery of philosophy puts it, political power is precisely the official expression of antagonism in civil society. End of footnote. At the same time, he has to admit that there is a distribution of general functions, if not division of labor, executives, and the need to administer the new forms. So, he finds himself using two significant phrases. The first, there will be no state in the present political sense. Here, Marx leaves open the possibility of a state in a rather different political sense. The second, what forms could management functions assume within such a worker's state, if he wants to call it that? We should read too much into the term worker's state, since it is an appropriated term and thus a placeholder. Of more interest is the other terminology Marx uses: general functions, management functions, government functions. None of these entail a state as it had been experienced and understood, as a power separated from and opposed to society, but some form of qualitatively distinct form of governance there must be, arising from communist society. Conclusion. To sum up, I have focused on Marx's suggestions as to what might happen to the state after a communist revolution. On this matter, Marx bequeathed a distinct tension to the subsequent tradition concerning the dictatorship of the proletariat and the commune. Clearly, both are found in Marx's texts, and he also seems to have been aware of the problem. All he offers are hints and initial thoughts as to how they may be related, suggesting the rudiments of a dialectical interconnection between the two. This suggestion moves towards, but does not decisively conclude, a situation in which both the proletarian dictatorship and the commune are part of the initial phase of communism. Further, in the 1870s, Marx began to struggle with the forms of administration or governance after a revolution and during the period of constructing socialism. While he usually suggests that the proletarian dictatorship deploys the mechanisms of the existing state to achieve its aims, implications arise in light of his argument that the dominant class determines the nature of the state. More significant are his efforts to outline the governing functions required after a proletarian revolution, of which he thought he caught a glimpse in the Paris Commune, working between his inbuilt assumptions and previously stated positions. He begins to speak apathetically of no state in the present political sense and positively in terms of management and governing functions. To add to these intriguing possibilities, the German word used when Marx discusses the transitional function of the dictatorship of the proletariat is none other than Aufhebung, Aufheben, noun and verb, which is best translated with the Latin-derived sublation. In the manifesto, he and Engels write that the old conditions of production, when the proletariat is the ruling class, are sublated with violent force. Even more, the outcome of the whole process is that the proletariat does the same to classes, and thereby its own domination. Further, in his letter to Wedemeyer of 1852, Marx writes that the proletarian dictatorship is a transition to the sublation Aufhebung of all classes, and in the later reflections on Bakunin, Marx deploys a dialectical narrative in which the workers' dictatorship is precisely the means for the proletariat to sublate itself as a class. This is, of course, a favored Hegelian term, now deployed in a materialist register, I have suggested that the best translation is sublation, both abolishing what has gone before and transforming it into a qualitatively distinct entity. The tantalizing suggestion arises whether the conditions of production and classes will not simply be abolished and destroyed, but that they will be transformed and continue in hitherto unexpected forms. Does this also apply to the state, which would then appear in a way not seen before, in a qualitatively distinct form of governance? Yet Marx was also profoundly reticent to offer much in the way of concrete prognostication. This was not so much due to a wariness of blueprints, but rather to the knowledge that he had not experienced a successful revolution, one that had seen off the counter-revolution and had found some peace and space to begin constructing socialism. After all, one needs concrete evidence to be able to elaborate and develop theories that arise from the evidence. As he observes in the Critique of the Gotha program, such a question can be answered only scientifically. To others would fall the experience and the consequent evidence, as well as the philosophical reflection necessary to understand what was happening, if not offer possible guides for action. That there would be unexpected turns and developments hardly needs saying. End of Chapter 2. Socialism in Power by Roland BOER. Chapter 3. Frederick Engels and the Foundations of Socialist Governance. Opening Remarks. In the previous chapter on Marx, I mentioned that it was Engels who provided the most substantial material on the nature of hitherto existing states and the potential nature of socialist governance. We may see this in terms of the division of labor between Marx and Engels, in which Engels not only provided the foundations for what became known as dialectical materialism, and coined the term historical materialism to speak of its specific application to socioeconomic matters, but also engaged in extensive research on the history of the state in Europe. It is from this latter research that Engels sought to elaborate the basic principles of socialist governance. As he did so, Engels also made some headway in solving the problems that Marx did not resolve. The following material is divided into 4 main parts. The first tackles the nature of states experienced thus far in human history, which Engels defines in terms of a separated public power. Engels also emphasizes the role of Gewalt, the power, force, and even violence entailed in bourgeois dominance. Since the semantic field of Gewalt cannot be captured by a single English word, I leave it in the original German. This leads to the second part, which focuses on the role of proletarian Gewalt through the revolutionary process, but especially after the seizure of power and the initial steps of socialist construction. The main manifestation of this proletarian Gewalt is, of course, the dictatorship of the proletariat, which Engels defended resolutely in the early 1890s against moderating tendencies. The third part deals with the much misunderstood concept of the dying away of the state. The position hammered out in the struggle with the anarchists under Bakunin in the 1870s is that the state would certainly not be abolished, Abschaffung, by a sheer act of will immediately after a proletarian revolution, but that its eventual disappearance, falling asleep of itself or dying away, would be one of the final results of the long construction of socialism. Theoretically, this approach arises from the point that the state is a superstructural feature built upon a socio-economic base. It follows that the primary focus after a proletarian revolution should be precisely on the necessary economic and social measures required for socialist construction. The fourth and final part deals with the principles of socialist governance, which for Engels entails that public power, Gewalt, stands in the midst of society and no longer has a political character, since class struggle will have become a feature of the past. Further, this public Gewalt is to be focused on the administration of the stuff of life and conduct of the economy for the good of the whole community. It would be far more complex and detailed than anything we have seen before. The state as a separated public Gewalt. Engels' proposals concerning actually existing states in human history have been deeply influential in Marxist historiography, but my interest here is in presenting the key findings and in identifying how they clarify and extend Marx's initial suggestions. Engels' most significant contribution is to be found in The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, which is primarily concerned with the state. Most of the material that follows is drawn from this text. Footnote: references to The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State are taken from the fourth German edition of 1892, since it contains much additional material compared with the first edition of 1884. End of footnote. To begin with, the key point is that the state is a public Gewalt that is separated from society. This definition not only sharpens the point that Engels and Marx had already developed in terms of the state arising from socioeconomic conditions. Footnote: the economic determination of the state is also emphasized in Engels' study of Feuerbach. End of footnote. But it also anchors all of Engels' observations concerning the nature and history of the state. Second, the state as a separated Gewalt may either be imposed from without or arise from within a society that is riven with the irreconcilable opposites of classes with conflicting economic interests. Footnote: in The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, Engels emphasizes the internal processes of class conflict that led to the emergence of the state, but in the Frankish period he writes of state power in the German Mark Association, which did not derive from these communities, but confronted them as something alien. End of footnote. Third, so that society does not break down entirely through such conflict, a Gewalt is necessary to alleviate the conflict and keep it within the bounds of order. Fourth, this Gewalt alienates itself more and more from society, so that it becomes separated, alienated, and above society. Fifth, the alienation of this Gewalt from society appears initially as a distinct armed force that is no longer of the people, as with a militia, but it also comes to include instruments of repression in terms of material adjunct, prisons, and institutions of coercion of all kinds. Sixth, alongside these instruments are the organs of society, which are not part of society, which do not stand in its midst, but are above and alien and need to be imposed on society, through a system of laws and by means of taxes. My interest here is not in elaborating these points for the sake of extensive treatment of historical states, or indeed of the capitalist state. Instead, I am interested in the implications for socialist governance. The key question is the nature of the public Gewalt. As we have seen, Engels defines hitherto existing states as separated from society, but this raises the question as to whether a form of public Gewalt exists or may exist that is not so separated. In the material under consideration, Engels does speak of organs of governance that stand in the midst of society. Here, he writes of pre-state formations, and elsewhere we find the observation that after a proletarian revolution, public functions will lose their political character, or, as the Communist Manifesto puts it, public Gewalt will lose its political character. Political character refers to the antagonistic reality of class struggle, which led to the state in its earlier forms. I will have more to say on these matters later in the chapter, save to emphasize here that in a communist framework there would indeed be a public Gewalt that would not be politicized, that would not be separated from society. Determination of the state. A further question concerns the relation between the state and the society from which it is alienated and separated. Depending on the context and specific issue at stake, Engels moves between three main positions. A. The state as a means of keeping down the oppressed is an instrument for exploitation by the economically dominant class. B. A state may gain relative autonomy either during a period of relative balance in class conflict, with neither class able to assert dominance, or when the state asserts its own agenda on the economy, which may hinder or favor economic development. C. The state may be an organization of the possessing class, so that we may speak of the state of slave owners, the feudal state, and the modern representative state, or the state of the capitalists, which is the ideal personification of the total national capital. Here, the implication is that the nature of a specific form of the state is determined by the class in control. Footnote. Note here also the comment in Engels' introduction to Borkheim's pamphlet concerning the 1848 revolutions. The state is becoming more and more estranged from the masses of the people and is now well on the way to transforming itself into a consortium of landowners, stockbrokers, and big industrialists for the exploitation of the people. End of footnote. While the instrumental and semi-autonomous approaches would come to characterize two main directions of subsequent Marxist scholarship on the capitalist state, footnote, the semi-autonomous line of subsequent Western Marxist scholarship has a number of varying emphases, while the instrumentalist position has been pursued by a smaller number. End of footnote. I am interested here in what is Engels' most sustained position. The nature of the state is determined by the class in power. Footnote. The closest that subsequent Western Marxist analyses have come to this approach is to suggest that the capitalist state, divided between apparatus and power, functions to provide a relatively stable environment for capital by ameliorating and regulating class struggle, economic crises, and uneven development. End of footnote. This approach is best embodied in the observation that with the rise of parliamentary democracy and its apparent universal suffrage, wealth exercises its power indirectly, but all the more surely. The role of Gewalt, Bismarck's Germany. The most significant case study of this indirect shaping of the capitalist state appears in the role of force in history. Footnote. The essay Role of Force was planned as the fourth chapter to an independent work that would include the 3 chapters on the same theme from a section of Anti-Düring. Although the volume was eventually published along with a belated English translation, the essay is treated as an independent work in critical scholarship. End of footnote. As a notable complement to Marx's focus on Louis Napoleon III in the 18th Brumaire, Engels' concern is Bismarck's rise to power and Germany's inevitable path to European dominance. Engels argues that no matter how much Bismarck may have sidelined the bourgeoisie from direct state power, he brought to completion the political and economic structures of a capitalist state. Since the bourgeoisie had since the mid-19th century expanded as never before the network of industry and international trade, it sought a unified German state with uniform laws, regulations, and currency to facilitate further development and enhance the easy mobility of labor. Bismarck obliged, enacting law after law that met bourgeois demands while ensuring that actual state power remained out of their hands. The bourgeoisie consented since they could see that Bismarck was not only shaping the new German state in their image, but that he was also protecting them from having to face their real enemy, the working class. Footnote. Elsewhere, Engels argues that the bourgeoisie's rise was intimately connected with the rise of absolute monarchies, a process that also entailed the bourgeoisification of older feudal classes since the economic conditions were increasingly determined by bourgeois norms. Here, a contradiction arises. Although the republic was the ultimate form of bourgeois rule, it was reluctant to embrace a republic at first due to a reluctance to face up to the working class. End of footnote. As Engels puts it, the bourgeoisie triumphed without having to put up a serious fight. Perhaps the time is overdue to say a little more concerning Gewalt, which I have left untranslated, since the term's semantic field includes power, force, and violence. But does Engels' use actually include such a range of meaning? In order to make a thorough scientific assessment, I tracked every usage by Engels in the 1870s and 1880s of Gewalt itself, the important adverbial form Gewaltsam and Mitgewalt, and the adjectival Gewalttätig, and the expected German link words such as Gewaltmaßnahmen and Gewalttätigkeiten. The outcome, the term is overwhelmingly used in its harder sense. To give a couple of more telling examples, in The Role of Force, Engels writes that the practice of Gewalt entails blood and iron, which boils down to brute force. Footnote. For a full list of citations concerning Engels' usage, see Frederick Engels and the Foundations of Socialist Governance, Roland BOER, 2021. End of footnote. Indeed, the way Gewalt plays out in the role of force is in terms of military machinations, beginning with the fact that German political and economic unity had to be won in struggle against external and internal enemies. The turning point was when reunification took the path of Prussian hegemony rather than Austrian hegemony or the genuine overcoming of differences between all German states. Humiliation at the hand of Denmark in the mid-19th century spurred Bismarck to undertake a comprehensive restructuring of the armed forces, resulting in decisive victory over Denmark within a decade. From this point, the path led eventually to the conquest of France, at which point the new German Empire became the first power in Europe, with all power concentrated in the hands of the dictator Bismarck. Footnote: here Engels uses Macht when speaking of power and strength. Although not as frequent as Gewalt in the text under consideration, we should note when the emphasis falls on power per se, Engels prefers to use Macht. When the more forceful and violent sense is to the forefront, he tends to use Gewalt and its associated terms. End of footnote. In terms of internal processes, Engels focuses on the tensions and collaborations between the bourgeoisie and Bismarck. The former demanded a revolutionary transformation of Germany, but this could be achieved only by Gewalt, which he immediately defines as only by an actual dictatorship. Two types of Gewalt exist in the modern state, namely the elemental Gewalt of the popular masses and organized state Gewalt as found the army. On both counts, the bourgeoisie faced problems. While it had become deeply suspicious of the force of the masses, it also did not have the army at its disposal. But, Engels points out, Bismarck had, so much so that he embodied Staatsgewalt. Thus far, I have covered relatively well-known territory concerning a Marxist approach to former states, and particularly the capitalist state. I have also pointed out that Engels in many cases sharpened and clarified Marx's ideas, setting the contours for subsequent, mostly Western, Marxist research on the capitalist state. With the treatment of Bismarck and the role of Gewalt, I have moved into material that, although relatively ignored in some circles, provides us with a central term for understanding the dictatorship of the proletariat. Dictatorship of the proletariat and socialist Gewalt. This section makes 2 points. First, Engels argued strongly that the proletarian dictatorship and the commune are coterminous in the initial phase of socialism in power. Second, we have Engels to thank for emphasizing the importance of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which he saw as a concrete manifestation of socialist Gewalt. In making these moves, Engels both clarified some of Marx's cryptic formulations and took a distinct step beyond Marx. Proletarian dictatorship and the commune. Engels used the terminology of proletarian dictatorship during 2 periods. Between 1872 and 1874, in the aftermath of the Paris Commune, and between 1890 and 1891 in his struggle with the rightist deviation in the German Social Democratic Party, which sought to downplay revolutionary struggle and the dictatorship of the proletariat. During the first period, Engels clarified the meaning of the proletarian dictatorship by distinguishing it from individual dictatorship, Bakunin, for example, or that of a small group, the Blunkist emphasis. Instead, after a proletarian revolution, the dictatorship that follows should be collective, comprising the entire revolutionary class, the proletariat. Further, in response to the Proudhonist current in the Paris Commune, Engels stresses that the proletarian dictatorship is not outside the mainstream of the working class movement. Every real proletarian party, he writes in The Housing Question, has a class policy according to which an independent political party is the primary condition of struggle, and the dictatorship of the proletariat is the immediate aim of the struggle. The process of clarification also led to step beyond Marx, the argument that the Paris Commune was itself a manifestation of the dictatorship of the proletariat. As noted in the previous chapter, Marx was unable to resolve the tension between the Commune and the proletarian dictatorship, although he did begin to offer a few hints. Engels would take these hints to their logical conclusion, identifying some of the measures instituted by the Paris Commune as acts of the proletarian dictatorship. Let me quote the main texts in which Engels makes this point before setting the context for such an emphasis. Quote, It does the commune the greatest honor that in all its economic measures the driving spirit was in accordance with the spirit of German scientific socialism. In the same way, when the so-called Blanquists made an attempt to transform themselves from mere political revolutionists into a socialist workers' faction with a definite program, they adopted, and almost literally at that, the views of German scientific socialism on the necessity of political action by the proletariat and its dictatorship, as the transition to the abolition of classes and with them of the state, views such as had already been expressed in the Communist Manifesto and since then on innumerable occasions. Of late, the German Philistine, footnote, the original manuscript had Social Democratic Philistine, when the editors of Die Neue Zeit replaced with German Philistine, end of footnote, has once more been filled with wholesome terror at the words dictatorship of the proletariat. Well and good, gentlemen. Do you want to know what this dictatorship looks like? Look at the Paris Commune. That was the dictatorship of the proletariat. First, if one thing is certain, it is that our party and the working class can only come to power under the form of a democratic republic. This is even the specific form for the dictatorship of the proletariat, as the great French Revolution has already shown. Otherwise, why should we be fighting for the political dictatorship of the proletariat if political power is economically powerless? Gewalt, states power, is also an economic force. Footnote. Note also the analogy between social and natural forces. In Anti-Düring, Engels describes the latter as working blindly, violently, destructively, but only when we do not understand them. When we do, we are able to subject them more and more to our own will, so that we can attain our own ends. So also with social and economic forces. Once we grasp them, they can be transformed from democratic masters into willing servants. End of footnote. By now, the point should be clear, and I refer the reader to detailed exegeses of these statements elsewhere. However, I would like to emphasize the context for these observations, especially from the early 1890s. The relevant texts by Engels appeared during a period when the communist world movement worldwide had made considerable progress. Political parties had established themselves and gained hundreds of thousands of members, especially in Germany. The situation produced extensive debate over theory, policies, and programs, but there was a new reality. Many of the proletarian parties were increasingly able to operate within the structures of the capitalist state and its form of democracy, with representatives often elected to parliaments. Pressure grew to soften communism's more radical edges, since some felt that these threatened the newfound legitimacy of the parties in question. The desire for moderation was enhanced in Germany by Bismarck's infamous anti-socialist laws from 1878 to 1890. Even though support for the German Social Democratic Party grew during this period, questions arose. Should the party continue to advocate illegal means, such as revolution and proletarian dictatorship, or should it be content to work within the existing structures and pursue peaceful transition? As an old revolutionary hand, Engels could see the need to be sensitive to the mood of the times, adjusting strategy where necessary, and warning against untimely insurrection where it would simply reinforce suppression. But he also insisted on core revolutionary positions, especially when he saw them threatened. The dictatorship of the proletariat was one such position, which he felt called upon to defend and uphold, especially in the early 1890s. Even more, he was adamant that a gentle and idealistic image of the commune, harking back to the utopian communism against which he and Marx had struggled in earlier decades, was a distortion. It was in this context that Engels dusted off Marx's notes and enabled the publication for the first time of Critique of the Gotha Program, gathered together Marx's essays under the title The Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850, wrote an introduction to the latter and also to the third edition of Marx's The Civil War in France, wrote a pointed critique of the Erfurt Program, and engaged in extensive correspondence. It is precisely from these works that I draw the most significant quotations above. All of these tasks sought to arrest the moderating wing of the German party and insist on the centrality of appropriate revolutionary action and the dictatorship of the proletariat. The risk Engels faced has certainly not disappeared. From time to time, rightist moderates have found the proletarian dictatorship distinctly embarrassing and even alarming, and have sought to water it down or dispense with it altogether. To give two examples. First, there is a tendency among some Western Marxists to focus in a one-sided manner on Marx's depiction of the Paris Commune and to tread softly on the proletarian dictatorship, with the result that socialism becomes a quasi-utopian project or is seen to operate within the horizon of capitalist liberal democracy. Footnote. See the strong rejection of such tendencies and their misrepresentations of the Soviet Union in Tong De Sin's study, 2012. End of footnote. Second, one of the manifestations of the ideological disarray in China that followed in the wake of the wild 90s was a struggle over the concept and practice of the proletarian dictatorship. This was a complex debate with a number of positions taken. Footnote. An earlier wave of debate turned on two key documents between 1975 and 1981. The first was a biased collection of texts from Marx, Engels, and Lenin, which was published in 1975 under the auspices of the Gang of Four, and sought to bolster the slogan of continuous revolution under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Renmin Rubao editors and Hong Chi editors, 1975. The second was the all-important resolution adopted at the 6th session of the CPC's 11th Central Committee, which criticized the slogan and its practice while upholding Mao Zedong thought and the manifestation of the proletarian dictatorship in the democratic dictatorship, CPC Central Committee, 1981. Scholars moved from endorsing the first to criticizing its promulgation by the Gang of Four to a reassessment in light of the 1981 resolution. I give a sample from among many articles relating to these evolving positions. End of footnote. Here, I am interested in a particular aspect of the debate. A few scholars had begun to urge a recovery of the concept as it had been promulgated earlier or as the basis for a theory of the socialist state, while others attacked the concept itself, whether in terms of its inherent flaws, its limited validity to the period of war against the counter-revolution, its tendency to move towards an autocratic populism that was already espied with Lenin, or its dangers in light of the chaotic deviation of the Cultural Revolution, in the sense that the slogan of continuous revolution of the dictatorship of the proletariat had led to autocratic tendencies, individual dictatorship, and the associated populism. In reply, other scholars undertook careful and detailed studies of the development of the concept in the works of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and argued that the deviation of the Cultural Revolution should be understood properly and not detract from the concept itself. They also emphasized, in light of the historical experience of socialist countries, that the concept concerns the transition from capitalism to communism, that it is collective in the sense that it includes the vast majority of rural and urban workers, and that it entails a new form of socialist democracy. In short, a significant effort was devoted to understanding the concept in all its dimensions, so as to counter leftist and especially rightist deviations, and to ensure its continued place in the Marxist tradition. Engels would agree. In his terms, the commune cannot be separated from the dictatorship of the proletariat, for they are one and the same. The commune was the dictatorship in action, albeit for too short a time, and hesitant to go further, or, as the letter to Conrad Schmidt put it, the dictatorship of the proletariat is both political power and economic potency. It is socialist Gewalt. Socialist Gewalt. The proletarian dictatorship is a concrete manifestation of what may be called socialist Gewalt. Engels speaks of this Gewalt in two ways, the first in terms of revolutionary action, and the second as the actual exercise of power. Already in the 1840s, Engels was speaking of the achievement of communist aims by no other method than a democratic, violent revolution. Through the 1870s, he often spoke of the right of the working class to use violent force in order to realize its demands. Indeed, it is recognized that Gewalt also operates with revolutionary effect. Engels's observations on the exercise of power after a revolution are more extensive. From a range of possible texts, I would like to focus on a work written in response to the anti-authoritarian push by the anarchists, who even opposed participation by workers in political struggle. Engels writes, "A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing." Footnote. The German translation of the original Italian article has Das autoritarste Ding End of footnote. It requires the imposition of the will of the majority of the population on the former ruling class by means of weapons, and in order to ensure the success of the revolution, it must maintain this rule by means of the terror which its arms inspire in the reactionaries. At this point, he invokes the Paris Commune, speaking not only of the authority of the armed people, but also reproaching it for not having used it freely enough. This is the sense in which we should read the observation in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, originally an anti-Düring. After observing the internal dynamic of the contradictions of the capitalist mode of production, Engels writes, "The proletariat seizes political power and turns the means of production into state property." The initial French of this text, La force publique, is rendered in the German edition of 1891 as Staatsgewalt, or as he puts it even more clearly in material added to Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, quote, "Proletarian revolution, solution of the contradictions, the proletariat seizes the public power, and by means of this power transforms the socialized means of production, slipping from the hands of the bourgeoisie into public property," end quote. Engels's position on socialist Gewalt should by now be clear, as also its inescapable connection with the proletarian dictatorship and thereby the commune. Uncomfortable as it may be for some, Engels, like Marx, saw the need for violent force in both the revolutionary process of seeking power and during the early exercise of power after such a revolution. The latter was for the sake of both transforming socio-economic conditions and dealing with counter-revolution. Engels also made explicit the connection between the dictatorship of the proletariat and the Paris Commune, seeing the latter as part of the initial stage of communist construction, while also providing glimpses of what the future might be. Finally, socialist Gewalt is also connected with the gradual dissolution and ultimate disappearance of the state. The eventual dying away of the state. One of the more misunderstood and misrepresented concepts promoted by Engels concerns the dying away of the state. Footnote: to give some examples of such misrepresentations, Engels and Marx were quasi-anarchists who believed in the Abschaffung, abolition of the state. They initially shared a general abolitionist stance, but later clarified their position in response to Bakunin and the anarchists. They were authoritarians and only toyed with the idea of the state's abolition, or the state would wither away, the common English term, very soon after a proletarian revolution, when class conflict would disappear and with it the state. End of footnote. In the brief space available here, I cannot provide all of the necessary background. Instead, I offer a summary and refer the reader to the exhaustive analysis in Friedrich Engels and the Foundations of Socialist Governance. My main concern here is to elaborate on Engels's clarification that one of the last outcomes of socialist construction would be the falling away of the state. Background summary. The initial background concerns German socialist circles in the 1840s, among which Engels and Marx moved. We find that while they spoke of the abolition, annihilation, and dialectical transformation of private property, money, and inheritance, they rarely, if ever, spoke of doing so to the state as such. Instead, they envisioned alternative structures, either of a new state or of a new form of social organization. This is true even of Proudhon, who deeply influenced these early German socialists. There is one notable exception. Max Stirner, in his liberal anarchist work, The Ego and Its Own, urged that the state should be completely abolished and annihilated. Thus, only when Engels and Marx and others, like Moses Hess, engaged with Stirner did they speak of the abolition of the state, finding Stirner's proposals wanting, since he focused on an act of pure will. It is only in 1850 that Engels and Marx speak directly of the abolition of the state for the first time. Notably, this is a critical response to what had become a popular slogan in all manner of circles, including bourgeois ones, where such an abolition entailed a bourgeois order in which they would be left alone to pursue their private gain. Crucially, this piece, which borrows the language of the slogan, identifies Stirner as the source and introduces the need for a delay in such an abolition. This delay is an early result of the method hammered out in the years before and expressed clearly for the first time in the Communist Manifesto of 1848. The primary concern should be socio-economic matters. Thus, a communist revolution would have these as its main task, while any falling away of the state would follow as an outcome of such activity. This would be the position, refined and sharpened, that both Engels and Marx would hold in the struggle with Bakunin, who first formulated a somewhat coherent anarchist position in the late 1860s and particularly in the 1870s. For Bakunin, the state was the prime cause and foundation of all exploitation and oppression, whether political or economic. Thus, the first task of a revolutionary movement upon attaining power should be to abolish the state. As a willed and conscious act, Bakunin struggled to show why the state should have this foundational role, at times connecting its quasi-sacred status with the role of the Christian church, but for Engels and Marx this approach simply did not make sense. In light of their approach, the state was a secondary phenomenon arising from economic conditions and class struggle. Thus, a communist revolution would need to enact wide sweeping changes to the means and relation of production before aspects of the superstructure, such as the state, could be addressed. In this context, we find an increasing emphasis that one of the final results of the process of constructing socialism, after other tasks had been achieved and the counter-revolution had been defeated, would be not the abolition of the state, but its falling away, disappearance, going to sleep. The terms all appear in works of this time. Finally, and as a way to sum up this position, Engels coined in the third edition of Anti-Düring of 1894 the famous slogan, "The state is not abolished, it dies away." It is to the clarification of this position in Engels' later writings that I now turn. Dying away of its own accord. In order to understand what Engels meant by the dying away of the state, I consider three texts: a letter to August Bebel of 1875, an addressed after Marx's death in 1883, and a passage from Anti-Düring. Engels' letter to Bebel seeks to provide comments and suggestions on a draft of what became the Gotha program, which united the Eisenach and Lassallean wings of the German parties into the United Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany. Engels writes, quote, "The people's state has been flung in our teeth ad nauseum by the anarchists. Although Marx's anti-Proudhon piece and after the Communist Manifesto declare outright that, with the introduction of the socialist order of society, the state will dissolve of itself and disappear. Now, since the state is merely a transitional institution of which use is made in the struggle, in the revolution, to keep down one's enemies by force, so long as the proletariat still makes use of the state, it makes use of it not for the purpose of freedom, but of keeping down its enemies, and as soon as there can be any question of freedom, the state as such ceases to exist." End quote. Note the terminology used: dissolve, disappear, and cease to exist. The emphasis here is on an objective process, instead of a willed act of abolition. Only when conditions are met, summed up as a socialist order of society, would the state begin to dissolve. Until then, it would be necessary to use the structures of the state to exercise Gewalt, so as to deal with class enemies and the counter-revolution. Historical experience would come to show that such enemies exist, both within and without a socialist country, and that this would be so during the long period of the coexistence of and struggle between capitalist and socialist countries. The second relevant text is on the death of Karl Marx, in which Engels writes, quote, "Marx and I, ever since 1845, have held the view that one of the final results of the future proletarian revolution will be the gradual dissolution of that political organization called the state, an organization the main object of which has ever been to secure by armed force the economical subjection of the working majority to the wealthy minority. With the disappearance of a wealthy minority, the necessity for an armed or repressive state force disappears also. At the same time, we have always held that in order to arrive at this and the other far more important ends of the social revolution of the future, the proletarian class will first have to possess itself of the organized political force of the state, and with its aid, stamp out the resistance of the capitalist class and reorganize society." End quote. Once again, note the words used: gradual dissolution and disappear. Most significantly, this is only one of the final results at the end of the revolutionary process, and indeed at the end of the long process of constructing socialism. Far more important are other tasks. see off the counter-revolution, stamp out the resistance of the capitalist class, and reorganize society along socialist lines. This is in direct contrast with the anarchists, who assert that the first task of a proletarian revolution is to abolish the state. Note also the opening statement. Both Engels and Marx had held such a position already since 1845. In the previous quotation from the Letter to Babel, Engels has mentioned Marx's critique of Proudhon from 1847 as well as the Manifesto from 1848, where he maintains he and Marx had already held to such a position. In his piece on Marx, he refers to 1845, the time when they were first working together and produced the Holy Family, and had begun working on the German ideology. In these earlier works, the articulation of the position on the state's final dissolution as one of the final results of socialist construction may not have been quite as clear as Engels suggests, but the point is that such a position is consistent with the whole method that he and Marx had developed. Socio-economic forces are primary, and the state, along with other features, such as philosophy, culture, ideology, and religion, are secondary. In other words, the forces and relations of production are the main concern, so only when they had been dealt with by various means of revolutionary action would it be possible to consider secondary phenomena, such as the state. As Engels wrote to Theodore Cuno, who was toying with anarchist ideas, we, on the contrary, say abolish capital, the appropriation of all the means of production by the few, and the state will fall of itself. This position flows from the whole approach Engels and Marx had developed. The third and final text comes from the third edition of Anti-Düring, where Engels uses for the first time Absterben, die away, to capture all of the usages we have noted: dissolve, disappear, cease to exist, and fall away of itself. Given its importance, I quote the text in full. Quote, as soon as there is no longer any social class to be held in subjection, as soon as class rule and the individual struggle for existence based upon our present anarchy and production, with the collisions and excesses arising from these, are removed, nothing more remains to be repressed, and a special repressive force, a state, is no longer necessary. The first act by virtue of which the state really constitutes itself the representative of the whole society, the taking possession of the means of production in the name of society, this is at the same time its last independent act as a state. State interference in social relations becomes, in one domain after another, superfluous, and then falls asleep of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things, and by the conduct of processes of production. The state is not abolished, it dies out. This gives the measure of the value of the phrase a free people's state, both as to its justifiable use at times by agitators, and as to its ultimate scientific insufficiency, and also of the demands of the so-called anarchists that the state should be abolished overnight. Footnote. A little earlier in the same work, Engels writes, the proletariat seizes political power and turns the means of production in the first instance into state property, but in doing this it sublates itself as proletariat, sublates all class distinctions and class antagonisms, also the state as state. End of footnote. This quotation not only sums up Engels' theory of hitherto existing forms of the state, but it also offers a narrative of the state's gradual dying away. By now it should be obvious that communism by no means advocates the Abschaffung of the state immediately or even soon after a proletarian revolution. Instead, the path to the state's falling asleep or dying away is long, arduous, and full of twists and turns. Engels speaks of class rule in a capitalist state, the anarchy, note the term, of capitalist production, collisions and excesses in the economy, and increasing class conflict. Only when this conflict reaches the point of a proletarian revolution can the state be deployed by the vast majority of workers to take control of the means of production on behalf of society. Again, note the emphasis. A question arises. What happens to the state when it ceases to be a separated public power, a special repressive force, acting independently and interfering in the economy and society? The fundamental alienation, to use an earlier Hegelian term, between state and society, so characteristic of capitalism and the bourgeois state, will die away. Thus the state itself, as a separate public power, dies away. What is to come in its place? The key phrase is the administration of things and the management of the production process. to which I now turn. Towards enmeshed socialist governance. Finally, we come to the nature of socialist governance after a proletarian revolution and the long road of socialist construction. That both Engels and Marx saw that such governance is necessary should be clear by now. As to what it might entail, Engels in particular offers basic principles rather than extensive prescriptions. The basic principles may be summarized as follows. Public Gewalt loses its political character and stands in the midst of society, becoming the administration of the stuff of life and the conduct of forces and relations of production for the genuine good of society. In what follows, I analyze each of the key terms of this brief statement. Public Gewalt standing in the midst of society. To begin with, public Gewalt will continue under socialism, but as an unseparated or integrated form of governance. To clarify, Engels had defined hitherto existing forms of the state as a separated public Gewalt. With the operative word being separated, it follows that if a public Gewalt is also would be present in socialism, then it must be an unseparated form. At a number of points, Engels and Marx speak of the need for social functions or public functions in a socialist system, even to the point of being analogous to governing functions of the state. These may be seen as alternative expressions of the need for a public Gewalt. Another way of describing this integrated public Gewalt is that it is a social organization that stands in the midst of society. This suggestion comes from a somewhat unexpected source. Engels' extensive study of pre-state formations that drew much of his energy in the 1870s and 1880s. I cannot go into all of the details here, save to note that these forms of administration and governance were highly complex. A. Multiple levels of councils were elected by popular assemblies in a system that may be described as naturally evolved democracy. B. Elections themselves were direct at the lower levels and indirect at higher levels of representative councils. C. Social, military, and religious leaders were elected and subject to recall. D. These layers of social organization undertook a wide range of administrative functions, from the management of land in common through promulgating communal norms and dealing with wrongdoing, to adopting strangers and stipulating funeral and burial rites. Clearly, this social organization or public Gewalt was complex and many-layered. However, it cannot be called a state in the sense of a separated public Gewalt. Instead, it was an organization of a society which as yet knows no state. It was not separated from, but stood in the midst of society. This is all very well, based as it was on the available historical and anthropological material of the time, but what relevance does it have for the enmeshed governance of socialism, let alone communism? To answer this question, let us turn to a remarkable work entitled The Mark. Footnote, this work was part of a larger project that sought to develop a historical materialist analysis of German history from the earliest records Roman to the present, with a particular interest in the pre-state formations of baseline communism. Given the pressures of other commitments, most of the work remained unfinished. End of footnote. Engels aims to provide a short historical sketch of how German peasants gradually lost their collective sovereignty over their land, and how it may be recovered. This narrative begins with collective ownership brought with the German tribes in their eastward migration and runs through Roman, medieval, and early modern capitalist periods. Two interrelated lines run through the text. One speaks of the gradual extension of private property, indebtedness, and loss of peasant rights. The other repeatedly points out that the practices and assumptions of the Mark run too deep in German consciousness and practice for them to be eradicated completely. These practices included the periodic reallocation of commonly owned field shares, common holding of woods, pastures, and minerals found in the soil beneath the level of a plowshare, the threefold pattern of village crop growing, in which one of three fields was always fallow and thus common property for the pasturage of animals, the common use of all other land, from forests and rivers to roads and fishing grounds. Engels also gives detailed attention to social organization through the Mark Assembly, which concerned legislation, administration, and jurisdiction within the Mark. It is the second narrative line that interests Engels most, for he seeks to reconstruct these practices for the sake of the communist project. The point, directed explicitly at peasant farmers, is that the communism of the future would entail a dialectical transformation of this baseline communism, pointing out that the peasants are at last able to act to improve their own conditions along with the workers. Engels writes, quote, "But how? By means of a rebirth of the mark, not in its old outdated form, but in a rejuvenated form, by a renewal of common land ownership, under which the latter would not only provide the small peasant community with all the prerogatives of big farming and the use of agricultural machinery, but will also give them means to organize, along with agriculture, major industries utilizing steam and water power, and to organize them without capitalists, by the community itself." Footnote. This final section first appeared in the edition published in Socialdemokrat in 1883. It appeared in all subsequent editions, including the 1891 appendix to the German edition of Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. Since this final section does not appear in the text provided by MEGA, I have quoted from the Werk, which provides the 1891 edition. End of footnote. Far from a hankering for the rural socialism of the European Middle Ages, or for an idealized primitive communism, or even for a secularized version of the religious return to paradise, this dialectical transformation would both negate this baseline communism and transform its core features into a qualitatively different reality. Communist forms of social and economic organization in the future would, in Engels' opinion, not entail an entire destruction of the old and a completely new beginning, as the anarchists were wont to suggest. Instead, it would involve a dialectical transformation of earlier moments of human history. Depoliticized governance. Further, a socialist public Gewalt would lose its political character. Engels writes, all socialists are agreed that the political state and with it political authority will disappear as a result of the coming social revolution, that is, that public functions will lose their political character. But what exactly is political character? It means the reality of class struggle and its manifestation in the state. As the Communist Manifesto observes, political Gewalt, properly so called, is merely the organized Gewalt of one class for oppressing another. It follows that when class distinctions have disappeared, the public Gewalt will lose its political character. As Pinich observes, Engels and Marx meant not the end of public authority in society, but the end of class repression as embodied in the state. Given the framework of the thought of both Engels and Marx, this would be one of the final results of the process of socialist construction, although from historical experiences, glimpses of this reality can already be seen at earlier stages. A concrete example of socialist Gewalt without the political character of class struggle concerns non-politicized elections. Is this possible? For those unfortunate enough to have been born and raised in the context of capitalist democracy, elections are assumed to be antagonistic, to be regulated forms of class struggle in terms of political parties vying for power. Witness the way every item, from health to international relations, becomes a political football, a way of scoring points against opponents, and results in the constant to and fro of policy implementation and its undoing. It follows that since class conflict is not to be a feature of socialist society, elections would not have the antagonistic nature of capitalist systems. Let us turn to Marx for an initial proposal concerning the possibility of non-politicized elections. In his notes on Bakunin's Statism and Anarchy, Marx observes that the nature of elections depends on the economic foundation and on the economic relations between voters. If these economic relations are antagonistic, and if classes have formed and are engaged in class struggle, then elections will have a political character. By contrast, if economic relations are not antagonistic, then the functions of governance cease to be political. Now comes the crucial point. By an absence of political functions, Marx means that there are no ruling functions. In other words, the distribution of general functions has become a routine matter which entails no domination. The outcome is that elections have nothing of today's political character. In sum, without the context of antagonistic economic relations and class conflict, which are characteristic of the capitalist state and its form of democracy, elections will have nothing of such a political character. Administering the stuff of life for the true interests of society. Thus far, We have considered the nature of a socialist public vault that stands in the midst of society and is depoliticized. The third principle concerns the administration of things and managing production. Footnote: the concept of the administration of things has a somewhat complex history. A comparable thought was expressed by Auguste Comte. The government of things replaces that of human beings. The idea is often attributed to Comte's teacher, Saint Simon, but note the difference from Engels. While Comte speaks of the government of things as a replacement for governing human beings, Engels writes of the administration of things, with the sense of administering or managing for the good of society. End of footnote. A number of statements to this effect appear from the 1870s onwards, emphasizing the need for efficient administration of Sachen and Dingen, the stuff of life, or the matters or things that pertain to human existence. The tasks here are simple administrative functions, or, more elaborately, the rule over people is replaced by the administration of things and by the conduct of production processes. Footnote: liberals, including those with a Marxist veneer, have willfully misrepresented the idea of the administration of things, suggesting that it reveals a technocratic and authoritarian approach in which human beings become things to be managed. By contrast, for Engels, it is not the management of human beings as things, but the administration of the stuff of life for the true interests of society. End of footnote. Although such administration would, in light of historical experience, turn out to be far more complex than either Engels or Marx anticipated, it clearly follows from the depoliticized nature of a public vault in a socialist system. Finally, what is the purpose of administering the stuff of human existence? As Engels puts it in On Authority, public functions will lose their political character and be transformed into the simple administrative functions of watching over the true interests of society. Watching over or guarding the true social interests, or as the later German translation has it, die wahren sozialen Interessen hüten. For Engels, and indeed Marx, this is precisely what depoliticization means. When public vault no longer has a political character, it serves the common good of the collective, or, to put it in more philosophical terms, for communism the common good is paramount. Concluding observations. To sum up, Engels' basic principles concerning the nature of socialist governance are as follows. 1. Public power vault continues, although it would not be separated from but stand in the midst of society. 2. Since it is not based on class conflict, it would lose its political character. 3. Governance entails the administration of things and the management of the processes of production for the sake of the true interests of society. 4. This reality may be seen as a dialectical transformation, an offspring of baseline communism. In light of the chapters to follow arising from the actual practice of socialist governance, the question of continuity and discontinuity arises. On this matter, it is important to strike a realistic balance to suggest that Engels and indeed Marx foresaw, or perhaps should have foreseen, all of the developments in later efforts to construct socialism is simply unrealistic. To propose that later historical realities departed significantly from the original thoughts of the founders is even more extreme and not sustained by the evidence. Far better is a balanced approach. Thus, there is clearly significant continuity, much more than one might expect, between the initial philosophical foundations and the historical realities of socialist governance. At the same time, in the actual construction of socialism, from the Soviet Union to China, one would expect to face new problems for which new solutions were and are needed, albeit based on the initial principles and the method through which they were derived. As Engels put it in 1890, so-called socialist society is not, in my view, to be regarded as something that remains crystallized for all time, but rather being in process of constant change and transformation, like all other social conditions. End of chapter 3.